Maybe you are lying in bed, letting your thoughts wander in the silence of the night. Or maybe you are cooking while the soft glow of the screen keeps you company. Or perhaps you are simply scrolling, looking for something that feels different, something that lingers. Here you are welcomed, because this channel is a place where we walk together into the shadowed corridors of ancient history, where the forgotten echoes of humanity still whisper. Tonight, we travel into the eerie mystery of the uncanny valley theory of human evolution. Stay with me as the story unfolds, and tell me in the comments how you use these journeys in your life. Do they help you sleep? Do they spark questions? Do not forget to subscribe. Your presence here matters more than you realize. Long before the lights of modern cities drowned the stars from our skies, before machines and screens pulled our attention into their glow, there was only darkness, fire, and memory. Humanity lived in a world of shifting shadows, a world that was never safe, never quiet, where every sound carried meaning. A broken branch could be a predator, a soft rustle could be prey, and a face in the darkness could be friend or foe. Our species did not rise in isolation. We walked the earth alongside others, other beings who looked so much like us, yet not quite, close enough to unsettle, far enough to threaten. And in that thin and wavering space between recognition and rejection, something ancient was born within us, an instinct that lingers still, the uncanny valley. Imagine the hunters following the daylight, their bodies tense, their minds sharpened by hunger. Suddenly, in the corner of their sight, a figure steps into focus, 2 arms, 2 legs, a face. But something is not right. The movements are familiar, yet twisted, the expression almost human, yet disturbingly strange. In that instant, the heart seizes, the air tightens. This is not family, and it might be danger. The roots of fear run deeper than monsters invented in story. They run deeper than our fear of machines copying us in the present age. They lie inside the marrow of our history, inherited from a world where survival meant knowing the difference between your own and something that was almost your own. When failing to recognize the difference could end not only you, but the fragile thread of your people, we stand today at a distance from that age, yet the tension of it returns in flashes, in the glassy, lifeless eyes of dolls, in the smooth but inhuman face of mannequins, in the strange imitation of human form that computers and machines now project. And though we live in modern homes with safe walls around us, that pulse of unease has never left. It is older than cities, older than writing, older than memory. This is the story of a hidden instinct, a deed pressed into our minds by the world of prehistory. Across this journey, we will walk through the lives of our ancestors. We will meet the beings they feared, the reasons they feared them, and through them we will glimpse ourselves. Because to know the uncanny valley is to know the ghosts that shaped what it means to be human. The first traces of our kind emerged in landscapes far older than the world we know today. The ground was alive with shifting seasons. Herds of great animals passed like rivers of muscle and fur, and the wind stirred through grasses that reached as high as the waist. Among this wilderness moved shapes not unlike us, scattered bands of ancient people whose lives hung on the balance of vigilance, cooperation, and memory. It was not a stage reserved for us alone, for the earth was home to many human-like beings, some towering and strong, others small and delicate in frame. Their faces bore the signs of kinship, but carried lines and proportions that betrayed a different origin. When 2 paths crossed, there must have been moments thick with hesitation, a tension born of recognition, entangled with unease. Our ancestors carried within them a tool far more enduring than flint or bone, a capacity to recognize patterns, to read a glance or a gesture in the shifting firelight. It kept them safer, more prepared, yet it also honed a sensitivity to difference, to the subtle dissonance between what was familiar and what was not. That edge of recognition unsettled them, and within their minds this delicate alarm became embedded like an inheritance. Picture the quiet of dusk, smoke rising from a small fire, figures crouched in circles, eyes turned outward toward the darkening trees. In the flicker of flame, their shadows stretched, bending against the stone walls, and every movement beyond the boundary was measured with suspicion. Yet imagine, too, that among that silence a shape emerges, shoulders like their own, a tilt of the head hauntingly familiar. And yet the mouth opens in a way that feels off. The eyes glance, but do not meet in the way a family member should. This near likeness is what stirred the heartbeat, what whispered a warning without words. The world was not only filled with threats of tooth and claw, it held threats that wore a face too close for comfort. And for the human mind, a face almost right, yet not quite seen to hold a hidden danger. Perhaps it promised disease carried from afar, perhaps conflict from another band, perhaps simply the uncanny sense of being near, but not belonging. Whatever the cause, the reaction was real, and it traveled from that ancient moment into the marrow of who we still are. Our ancestors would have met Neanderthals in the forests of Europe, stockier, broader, shaped by an Ice Age life. Their eyes and expressions might have carried both kinship and distance. Further to the east, other hominids roamed Denisovans, whose very features we cannot reconstruct with certainty, yet whose traces remain in our bloodline, even now, and in Africa itself, the root of our kind many. Branches once sprouted, and not all survived the struggle of coexistence. The uncanny valley, as we feel it in artificial faces, today was perhaps seeded in those encounters, not by machines, not by statues, but by living beings, reflections of ourselves shaped through a different path. These near doubles stirred a mixture of recognition, respect, and caution, a tangle of emotions strong enough to echo even across the ages. And so, though fires have long gone out and languages have changed beyond measure, the ancient reaction still lingers within our gaze when we confront a likeness that is close, but not quite. In the wide plains that opened beneath endless skies, survival was a tapestry, woven with countless threads. Each choice, each instinct, each moment of awareness swayed the fragile balance between life and loss. Generations before us lived with a heightened sense of observation, cultivated not in comfort, but through necessity. In this world, the human eye became not just a tool of sight, but of judgment, searching constantly for signs of closeness or strangeness, for allegiance or danger. There is something almost mysterious about the face. It is the first canvas of recognition. It is where warmth is read, where trust is built, where anger or betrayal begins. It is also where unease can take root, the line of the cheek too angular, the eye set just a measure wider or narrower than expected, the mouth moving with rhythms that felt almost human, yet rang faintly false. These differences might seem small, but for the ancient mind they carried weight as heavy as any weapon. The uncanny valley, though named in modern times, is much older than the name. Itself long before robotic faces or digital recreations are genetic. Memories were shaping responses to threats, cloaked in near familiarity of face. Almost like our own, but carrying the slightest distortion, could mean the presence of another kind of human. One who shared our world, but not our blood. One who might compete for food, land, or mates, and whose closeness magnified the danger more than distance ever could. Consider the forests of Ice Age Europe, the dense canopy pressing back the light, where Neanderthal families may have gathered in caves, their fires casting heavy glows across stone, their silhouettes bulking large and powerful. They were not monstrous, not predators beyond imagining. They were human in their own right, but different. And so the encounters between them and our early ancestors would have been charged with complexity. Not merely the metallic clash of conflict, but the quiet tension of recognition, of looking into eyes and seeing something deeply human, yet not quite self. In such meetings, the uncanny feeling we know today as discomfort may have been more than a passing sensation. It could have been adaptation itself, shaping who we trusted, who we avoided, whom we fought, and whom we fled. It may have been a compass guiding us through an uncertain world, keeping us cautious and attentive. And yet, it was not only the great rivals of the North that stirred these feelings. The African homelands cradled species that were smaller, stranger, some no taller than a child, their proportions unsettling. Their presence near water or cave might have startled those wandering bands of early humans. Imagine the unease of finding footprints in soft earth, so human-like, so delicate, yet belonging to no family known. An encounter like that would set fire to old instincts, to observe from the shadows, to question the closeness of what one could not fully recognize. This lesson carried itself forward, curling through thousands of seasons, whispering that likeness demanded caution. The familiar face was not always safe, because it was sometimes nearly ours, and yet carried foreign breath, in that delicate, uncanny distance between kinship and strangeness. Evolution etched a survival code into our bones, and it lingers each time we look upon a figure that almost belongs to us, but casts the faint shadow of otherness. Across valleys carved by ancient rivers, where stone rose jagged against the horizon, and winds carried the scent of distant rains. The rhythm of existence was written in the constant act of watching, listening, and weighing what was safe and what was not. It was a rhythm older than memory, and it shaped the instincts that still hum quietly within us. For early humans, the world was never empty. It was filled with the eyes of animals, with the traces of vanished footsteps, with trails of predators winding like threads across the earth. But alongside these presences were the others, beings who were not beasts, yet not entirely kin. Shapes that could walk upright, could stare back with intelligence, could hold objects and build fire, the unsettling near reflections of ourselves in the heartlands of Africa. Scholars now uncover fossils of species that lived unexpectedly close in time, some delicate in frame, standing hardly higher than the chests of those who might encounter them, their skulls small but human-like, with proportions that seemed unsettling to modern eyes. To imagine one stepping out from the undergrowth is to understand why unease may have taken root. One gaze, and the mind would reel between recognition and doubt, the uncanny resonance ringing like a soft alarm. To live among such diversity meant that identity was never simple. A human would have looked into faces that called forth both familiarity and strangeness at once, and recognition carried a cost. Families might ask, was this traveler distant kin, a rival, or a danger cloaked in near resemblance? Trust and suspicion mingled, shaping the earliest codes of survival. Even when close enough to interbreed difference, still lingered like a faint line separating self from other bodies might intertwine. Bloodlines might cross, but in day-to-day life, the perception of distance remained fueled by subtle distortions of gesture or voice, and in this tension, the uncanny carved its place deeper into the human sense of awareness. Firelight would have amplified this feeling, for within its flicker shadows distorted, turning bodies into shapes both familiar and warped. One can almost see the scene of hunters gathered in caves, their features shifting with every movement of flame, eyes glowing unnaturally, mouths twisting in exaggeration. It is not difficult to imagine that myths were born from such visions, stories of spirits and half-humans, born from the unease of watching a face change into something other, even when it had been known only moments before. The landscapes of Eurasia added their own layers. Here, where cold winds swept across open plains, the presence of Neanderthals was constant, not as a rumor or shadow, but as a daily truth. Their footprints pressed into snow where mammoths roamed, their tools scattered across hunting grounds. When our distant ancestors saw their fires in the distance, glowing orange against winter night, perhaps their stomachs clenched with both fear and wonder. For across the field burned a reflection of themselves, both strange and achingly familiar. This was the environment that honed a mind capable of rejecting closeness when closeness carried danger, of sensing that nearness did not always mean safety. Survival whispered to keep distance from what was almost right, but not perfect. And so the uncanny valley was etched ever deeper, as natural to those lives as the sound of wolves in the distance, or the rush of rainfall on stone. The story of humanity has never been a single thread. Instead, it is a braid of many strands, some bright, some faint, some long since cut away. And when we wander back into those forgotten paths, we find ourselves surrounded by the echoes of kin who walked beside us, creatures who shared our landscapes but carried faces. Just slightly misaligned voices, just slightly foreign gestures that mimicked our own, yet pulled away from them like a mirror warped. To travel through these lands in imagination is to walk among shadows of other peoples. Think of Australopithecines, small and light, moving nimbly among the trees, their forms like delicate sketches of what humanity would later become to us today. They look strange in fossil, remains hips sloping differently, faces angled against the patterns we know so well, but to those who may have still encountered their kind, the experience would have been even more profound. Not an artifact on display, but a breathing figure at the edge of a watering hole. Now picture that meeting. A hunter kneeling to drink, the cool water surrounding their reflection, when suddenly another reflection mingles in the surface, shoulders narrow, limbs brittle but present, a face hovering just at the edge of humanity, dark eyes blinking with thought. The hunter would feel the hairs rise across their arm, that deep primeval signal that this is near but not quite, familiar but wrong. And it is in those tingling heartbeats that instincts are reshaped. Slowly, the uncanny became a language of warning, one not written on stone or sung around fires, but carried silently within the body. To distrust the almost was to preserve the certain, to guard family from risks hidden in resemblance. It was less about hatred and more about survival, a soft shield against the confusion of likeness that threatened to dissolve boundaries. In caves scattered across the world, paintings would later tell of animals, of hunts, of cosmic patterns in the sky, yet no traces speak clearly of these uncanny encounters. They are memories without words inherited, instead through the simple pulse of recognition gone awry, passed through generations as attention. We still feel within the glacial valleys where Neanderthals lingered longest. The same impulse might have whispered to keep fires apart, to avoid blending too closely. Even when lives brush together, their tools are not so different from ours. Their shelters tell of minds capable of vision and care. Yet the subtle differences of muscle, movement, and gaze made every meeting a moment of reckoning. It is haunting to think that much of what shapes us is unseen, not written as history, but felt as sensation. The uncanny valley itself is less a story to read and more a shadow carried, a way of reacting when the eyes meet what is known and what is nearly known, a push to step back, even when the instinct to step forward demands it. Through these countless small moments, the path of our kind was carved, more sharply, not simply by tools or fire, but by the way we judged faces. How we felt the rhythm between safety and danger deep within us in that delicate judgment lives the ancient whisper, the one that has resisted time, softly repeating that not everything familiar belongs. Within us, far to the east, where mountains rose like great silent fortresses and rivers carved their way. Through endless valleys, there lived the mysterious Denisovans, a people, now known only through fragments of bone and the whispers of DNA carried in our blood. Unlike the Neanderthals with their broad bones and well-studied tools, the Denisovans remained shaped more by wonder than certainty. They were human in nature, yet strange in absence, existing as a shadow race, half glimpsed through time. Imagine the presence of such beings in the high plateaus of Central Asia, their lungs perhaps stronger for the thinness of air, their muscles grown for the harsh demands of a colder world. To meet them would be to confront a mirror obscured by fog, similar enough to stir immediate recognition, but veiled in ways that strained the comfort of the familiar. What did their voices sound like? What did their eyes reveal? These are truths we may never fully know, but to those who walked beside them, the sensation could not have been vague. It was intimate and immediate. For a young child in those ancient days, the encounter may have been recorded not as language, but as feeling. The shiver of watching a figure move with all the grace of a human, yet observing that the hands curved slightly differently, that the jawline caught the firelight in unsettling silhouette. Parents would caution, would murmur warnings as they kept families close, breathing into their children a lesson deeper than words, that a shape nearly yours may not be yours at all. The uncanny valley grew stronger each time. Such lessons were reinforced, becoming as natural as fire or hunger, not seen as something extraordinary, but as a quiet thread stitched into survival itself. Long before names and theories, unease was its own philosophy, guiding choice and shaping destiny. These hidden cousins, Neanderthals in the forests, the Denisovans in the mountains, smaller beings lingering near river deltas, together with our kind, formed a chorus of presences across the ancient earth, never neatly divided, but brushing close in both cooperation and tension. And at the heart of these encounters pulsed the question of identity. How to recognize family when confronted by a face so deeply human, yet singing with a different rhythm. The echoes of coexistence live within us still, in the portions of Denisovan D and I, woven through the strands of people in Oceania or Tibet, in the subtle remnants of Neanderthal traits lingered in the populations of Europe and beyond. Our living bodies are time capsules, recording encounters long faded into dust. And yet, even with bloodlines entwined, the uncanny remained. For closeness in reproduction did not erase distance in recognition. Think of how the mind processes a puppet with hands too precise, yet eyes too empty. How unease flickers when a robot smiles without the warmth of breath. That same quiet recoil may reach back not to factories and laboratories, but to the mountain paths where ancient people once exchanged glances that stirred caution more than kinship. Thus, the uncanny valley is not invention, but inheritance. An ancient compass pointing away from what is nearly us, but marked by strangeness. Across the centuries, the faces have changed, but the pulse of unease remains steady. Quieter now, perhaps, hidden beneath layers of culture and story, yet unbroken, persistent as heartbeat itself. In the ancient landscapes of Southeast Asia, far from the ice-swept valleys of Europe or the mountain fortresses of the steppe, there lived yet another branch of this intricate human family. A small-bodied creature known now as Homo floresiensis, uncovered only in recent memory by modern science, yet alive and moving in the days of our distant grandparents. They were tiny in stature, no taller than a child, fragile in appearance compared to the larger figures of Neanderthals or our own kind, yet capable of tool-making and perhaps of fire itself. Imagine walking in a dense island forest, vines coiling overhead, palms rustling in humid winds, and from the corner of vision, a figure stirs between the shade and the sunlight. Its form strikingly human yet reduced, delicate, unsettling to early travelers or hunters. Such an encounter may have carried an even sharper pang of unease, for though the figure moved as they did, it bore a scale and proportion that broke the pattern of expectation. The brain caught in the tension between familiarity and distortion, whispering that this creature is like us, but somehow not us. Fire circles in those days must have cradled stories of such sightings, stories passed from tongue to tongue, heavy not with detail but with impression, a kind of oral mist surrounding an experience too strange to settle into normal speech. These tales may have spoken of tiny people in the forests, echoed as warnings to keep children close, to keep guard at riversides, to sleep lightly in caves. The uncanny arises not only from the face and its patterns, but from size and proportion too, a reminder that to the human mind, expectation is everything. When something appears close yet broken in scale, an instinctive disquiet begins. It is not evil. It need not threaten at all. Yet the system of ancient survival recoils just the same. How striking to imagine that those who left footprints on the island of Flores may have continued their survival deep into the recent centuries. Small enclaves of their kind, flickering near caves and groves, lingering as shadows too fleeting to be carried into writing. Their very presence a living embodiment of the uncanny, almost human kin walking beside larger cousins, existing at the edge of sight and memory. In every corner of the globe, evidence suggests the earth was once crowded with echoes of humanity, islands of otherness that pressed against our own waters, lines of firelight that mirrored our own, but held unfamiliar faces. And each encounter reminded the mind and body that danger need not roar with fangs. Sometimes it simply wore a strange variation of our reflection. To wander this world, then, was to live not in isolation, but in a chorus of difference, and the uncanny valley was the hymn that kept us cautious. A quiet instinct honed, not by the hum of machinery, but by the footstep of neighbors who were close, yet always just a line apart. The islands of the ancient world held secrets unlike those of the vast continents, for isolation shaped life into strange and delicate forms. Creatures shrank or swelled, depending on what the land could provide, and humans, too, were touched by these transformations. It was upon such isolated shores that the lines between familiarity and strangeness grew sharpest, stirring that vibration in the mind that would later be given the name uncanny. On the small and rugged island of Flores, where the land trembled with volcanic fire and the sea pressed close on every side, Homo floresiensis made their home. Diminutive in stature, their tools rough yet purposeful, their very existence a mirror to remind us that evolution cares little for categories. They were human-like yet different, and their presence must have unsettled those who first glimpsed them, though perhaps the memory itself dissolved into story and legend before it could ever be fixed as fact. Consider the moment of discovery centuries ago, when one wandering hunter followed the sound of movement in the jungle, expecting perhaps a deer or a bird startled into flight, only to find a figure crouched upon the roots of a banyan tree, its proportions so near to his own kin, yet shrunken, its head lifting with small black eyes that seemed far older than its frame. The hunter would catch his breath, his heart quickening in wonder and warning, for such a sight does not belong purely to kin, nor purely to stranger. The island forests must have held whispers of such encounters, marked into human patterns of memory, not as details, but as impressions. Children warned to avoid venturing into wooded hills. Fires lit against an unease that stirred not only from the thought of predators, but from the suspicion that other beings moved between the trees, small and elusive, so alike to those who feared them that the difference itself was what disturbed. And it was not Flores alone where echoes lingered, for other islands too bore the bones of mysterious branches of humanity, each shaped by its own environment, each close enough to unsettle those who shared the space. And in these half-concealed relationships, we glimpsed the fertile soil from which the uncanny valley grew, not as myth, not as theory, but as the quiet pulse of lived experience. Far more than predators or storms, it was these faces at the edge of recognition that demanded the keenest awareness. For a tiger could be known, and fought or fled, but another human-like figure so close, almost comforting, threatened to collapse the careful boundaries of identity, family, and tribe. Proximity itself made them dangerous, and so within the mind unease curled tightly, ensuring vigilance whenever closeness felt cracked by strangeness. Some scholars suggest that memories of these encounters may survive in stories carried across cultures, tales of little folk dwelling in mountains, of shadow beings who live alongside people but never fully among them. Though impossible to prove, such echoes stir the imagination. Perhaps myths are not inventions at all, but fossils of perception, the lingering bones of feelings too deep to articulate. In the hush of evening, our ancestors may have told such stories around the fire, watching the flames as if shapes might appear in the shadows beyond, explaining to their children why unease was not to be ignored, why near likeness was a reason to be wary. And within each tale, the uncanny valley was reinforced, not in words like ours, but in instincts that echoed for generations. Beyond the forests of islands and the echoes of small-bodied beings, the great continents themselves were stages for encounters, just as unsettling. For the face of the world was wider than richer in its diversity of humankind, and each branch left imprints not only in soil and fossils, but in the intangible architecture of memory. The uncanny valley spread itself not across maps, but across the nervous systems of those who survived these meetings. In the colder lands to the north, the Neanderthals built their lives with patient strength, their hands skilled in chipping stone, their bodies steady Beneath heavy hides their shelters crafted with purpose. When our ancestors approached their realms, it was not as strangers arriving to empty earth, but as kin trespassing into. Another household fires already burned stone tools, already marked the ground voices, already filled the caves. To stand before a Neanderthal must have been both uncanny and moving. Their faces not monstrous as early stories once painted, but thick-boned, broad-featured, vibrant with life, a reminder of ourselves yet altered in ways that unsettled the delicate eye. The ridges of the brow pronounced, a body denser, the cadence of movement both familiar and strange. In this likeness fractured by difference, the uncanny grew strong, reinforcing itself with every exchanged glance. Imagine two groups, hidden on opposite hills, their fires seen across the valley, smoke curling into the purple dusk sky, both flames speaking of family and survival, yet each group knew the other was not fully them. The recognition carried longing perhaps, curiosity too, but beneath it was wariness, sharpened by instinct and carried like stone within the chest. The uncanny does not thrive in the clear and obvious. It is born in the near and the uncertain. It is the breath caught when one cannot decide if another belongs or threatens. And it is in this ambiguity that entire strategies of survival were formed. Distances maintained, warnings told in stories, territories guarded, and bloodlines carefully chosen. It is often easy for us now to imagine such meetings as ropes pulled tightly between violence and peace. But perhaps the truth stretched somewhere softer, yet more haunting. Perhaps trade occurred, perhaps even moments of shared kindness flickered like fragile sparks. Yet that feeling of unease, that deep whisper of difference, would never fall silent. Even in companionship, the uncanny stirred, keeping vigilance sharp and connection cautious. One can almost picture a child watching a Neanderthal from some distance, hidden in brush, watching the powerful arms carry a carcass, the movements so much like their own family. Yet the figure enormous, the face shaped by unfamiliar planes, and in that moment the child learns. A lesson deeper than language, that not all familiar shapes are safe, and that lesson then breathes onward into generations, lingering as instinct. Over the millennia, as some of these beings faded from existence, their traces remained in us, not only in strands of DNA but in the very architecture of emotion. Unease folded into our reactions, much as scar tissue folds into skin. It cannot be erased because it was carved into the conditions of survival itself. And so thousands of years later, when we look upon a mask carved too closely to human likeness, or the glass eyes of a doll that almost seem alive, or the synthetic face of a machine that smiles without warmth, we feel not only the strangeness of technology, but perhaps the call back to firelit nights when figures in the distance mirrored our form with unsettling difference. An instinct told us to step carefully, to remain on edge, to survive. The world our ancestors knew was never silent. Even in the seeming stillness of night, there were always movements, always sounds, and always the presence of others beyond the edge of firelight. The forests whispered with wind and animal life. But the most unsettling presence was the one that carried human likeness, the silhouette that walked as we walk, crouched as we crouch, and yet carried lines across the face that betrayed another path of origin. To live in such a world meant never forgetting that the face of humanity was not one, but many. Our species was but a single branch among countless roots, and though those roots twisted close together, their leaves did not always entwine in harmony. Instead, they brushed and strained against one another, some curling upward, some drying where light did not reach. Survival becoming not just a battle against beast and storm, but against those who are nearly our reflection. Neanderthals and Denisovans were perhaps the most prominent of these shadows, but there were others whose bones speak faintly across time, fragments that suggest yet more variations, faces we will never fully reconstruct, and yet which stood close enough to our ancestors to stir that deep instinctual response of caution. In truth, human history is more a crowded chorus than a lone melody, and in that crowdedness the uncanny was born. When we look back now, We can see traces in the soil, footprints pressed into fine ash where children once ran, their small impressions followed by larger steps, telling us of families long gone. And yet, in imagination, one wonders, were these prints always made by the same species? Or did they sometimes run beside prints that echoed our own, but belonged to another? One can imagine a mother's heart racing as she guided her child away from markings too close to home, yet not her own. For the uncanny valley was not abstract. It was lived in glances exchanged at watering holes, in the still tension that falls across a valley when two fires glimmer in the distance, in the hushed words around a circle warning children never to follow strangers who looked almost familiar. These rules of survival bound communities together, whispered not as theories, but as instincts carried in breath. The lessons embedded themselves slowly, the feeling of unease becoming a teacher deeper than words, shaping the way societies grew to protect their boundaries, shaping even the earliest sparks of culture. For the stories we tell reveal what frightened us, what demanded our attention, and within myths of half-humans, forest spirits, and otherworldly kin, there may live the faint memory of species now vanished, whose uncanny likeness planted the seed of those tales. It is haunting to realize that even our capacity for art may have drawn partly from this instinct. For in cave walls, humans depicted forms of animals so detailed they still capture imagination. Yet faces close to human appear sparingly, perhaps avoided, perhaps too strange to capture without stirring unease. In the silence of what is not represented, the uncanny leaves its shadow. The valley we describe today with wires and machines was in its first form a human landscape, crowded with variety, with mirrors cracked slightly in their reflection. And our ancestors learned to navigate that space, their caution enabling them to carry life forward, until one day our branch became the one that rose as others faded, yet encoded within us still lingers that pulse of unease. As the centuries rolled and seasons bent across the earth, the encounters between our ancestors and their cousins must have etched themselves into the rhythm of daily life. For coexistence was neither fleeting nor rare, but a truth that spanned thousands upon thousands of years. It is difficult for us now to imagine such longevity, to grasp the patience of time when two species might share valleys for longer than all of recorded history combined, and yet somehow remain distinct, bound together by proximity, but separated by trust and instinct. Across grasslands where mammoth herds thundered, and birds scattered against skies, wide and endless humans and us, Neanderthals surely watched one another, not casually, not without weight, but with attention, sharpened into ritual errands to gather firewood, may have ended with glances caught through the trees' footprints discovered where none should be, soft breath drawn sharp as the uncanny returned, reminding one that the world was not empty. The uncanny itself thrived in these small moments, not in sudden clashes, but in the long-drawn observation of difference. Each time a Neanderthal brow shadowed in firelight seemed too heavy, each time a Denisovan face carried features both familiar and unsettled, the instinct grew sharper, more deeply seated into the emotional soil of humanity. It is in repetition that instincts are strengthened, and over generations the valley deepened. Imagine the stories told in those nights, smoke curling and embers drifting upward into rising constellations' voices, passing on warnings as carefully as they passed on skills of hunting or fire. Perhaps a child asked why a figure with a human shape could not be approached as one of their own, and instead of logical explanations, the parents simply narrowed, the voice lowered the tone, impressed within them the feeling of distance, the sense that something is close enough to tempt and not safe enough to embrace. If one looks across time, it becomes clear that unease is often the first mark of boundary. It protects more swiftly than reason. It halts the hand from touching fire before one understands why it burns, and so too with faces almost right, but not fully. Before one understands the lineage or the science, the body already knows to recoil, the heart already beats faster. The environment itself amplified that sensation. for caves echoed with sounds that distorted shapes into uncanny specters. The fall of firelight across stone-bent features into sharp, unnatural shadows. Hunters returning at dusk may have glimpsed their own kin mistaken momentarily for strangers, their hearts jolting before recognition soothed them. But in those moments, the ancient reflex was practiced still, drilling vigilance into their bones. This sensitivity may have guided not only survival, but also community, for trust was reserved for the familiar, and the line between belonging and otherness was marked deeply. In a world where resources meant life or death, the smallest hesitation, the faintest difference, could rupture or preserve. Thus the uncanny became more than a shiver. It became a quiet framework through which we shaped the limits of who we were and who we were not. Over millennia, the other branches began to thin, their fires dwindling, their caves emptying, until their voices were heard no longer. But the instinct they had carved into our kind remained, pressed into the folds of the human mind like tracks set hard in clay. The shape of them gone, the feeling of them unbroken. So much of the past survives in silence, not as artifacts lifted from the ground, but as emotions passed unknowingly through generations. The uncanny valley is one of those silent inheritances, and its echo rings through us not because of puppets or machines, but because we once looked across a clearing and saw ourselves staring back, nearly the same, but not the same. The uncanny does not bloom in noise. It germinates in silence in those moments when one face lingers too long in the firelight, when one figure on the horizon seems familiar yet wrong, when the shape within the trees moves as we move, but with rhythms just slightly askew. Our ancestors lived in such silences, and it was in them that the valley deepened. By the shores of rivers families knelt to drink, while remaining guarded of shapes that lingered upstream by the edges of forests. Hunters traced tracks that looked dangerously human, but veered into patterns their minds could not claim. Each encounter reinforced the boundary between self and other, a line invisible yet powerful, a line written not on maps but into marrow. It may be tempting to imagine these memories fading with the passing of species, yet they persisted, carried forward not as stories alone, but as physical inheritance, as pathways of perception coded into brains that had learned always to treat the almost as suspect. Unease is not an error in our system. It is the system itself, a memory older than language. In the high valleys, where ice pressed against cliff sides, the Neanderthals endured, their shelters built with resourceful patience, their hands carving tools that could rival our own, and yet every impression they left stirred more than admiration. It stirred the uncanny, for there is little more unsettling than recognizing brilliance in a being you cannot call your own. The closeness of talent making difference feels sharper, not softer. Perhaps this is why myths across the world carry tales of neighbors that mirror humanity. Some called giants, others spirits, some small, some strange in feature, yet consistent is the sense that they are not entirely absent, but not truly family either. Myths themselves may be the fossilized form of unease, shadows of real encounters, whose specifics dissolved, but whose impressions persisted. Picture again, a fire at night, families gathered with skins, pulled close against the cold, the fire painting soft hues on their faces. Outside the circle lies darkness within darkness. Possibility a rustle may be an animal, or it may be another tribe, or perhaps most unsettling of all, it may be figures like them, but not them. Close enough to provoke recognition, distant enough to demand caution. In that moment, unease is not distraction. It is shield. These instincts would shape more than encounters with living kin. They carried forward into early art, into carvings and paintings that often leaned toward animals and abstract symbols rather than unfamiliar humans. Perhaps the artists themselves recoiled from pressing that likeness against cave walls. Perhaps some boundary told them that to linger too closely on faces poorly understood was to invite their unease into permanence. And in this restraint, we sense the power of the uncanny, not dramatic, not violent, but persistent, shaping emotion, choice, culture, and memory across ages. whispering to every heart that safety lies in what is fully known, and that what is nearly known may be danger masquerading as kinship. Thus the valley continued to widen, even as time carried species into silence. The reflex remained and grows into us still, present even when the beings who first provoked it have vanished, making us living archives not only of survival, but of fear, custodians of instincts pressed into us by encounters long dissolved into dust. The landscapes of ancient Earth were tapestry woven from contrast, ice grinding in the north, heat shimmering over savannas, forests heavy with rain, seas carving borders where people could only imagine what dwelled beyond. Within these settings, the uncanny feeling was nurtured, for each land revealed beings who pressed against the borders of familiarity in new and unfamiliar ways. On the great plains of Africa, lions and elephants ruled. Yet even more unsettling than the largest predator was the presence of shapes that were nearly human stalking the same fields. Smaller in frame, different in proportion, rivals who could not be dismissed as beasts, for they carried in their gait a mirror of those who watched them. Survival demanded that these encounters not be dismissed, but measured carefully, and this caution sharpened unease into habit. Generations of interaction wrote this habit into the nervous system, deepening the instinct that recoiled at the not quite right. Mothers taught it to children, not in words but in gestures. The quick pulling of a hand when a stranger approached the fire, the sharp motion of gathering family when foreign silhouettes lingered in the distance. Children grew within this atmosphere of unspoken warnings, and those warnings became their inheritance. Think of story rather than theory. Imagine the tale spun across countless cabs' hushed voices, describing encounters at creek beds or caves where other fires glowed the listeners, leaning close not with disbelief, but with the awareness that such stories might shape whether tomorrow's journey brought danger or survival. Such stories wove unease into culture, embedding it deeper than any tool or ornament. Even when cooperation occurred, trade in stone or exchange of food, there remained the fine thread of uncanny tension, a knowledge that trust could stretch only so far, and that beneath the face, so like one's own there, dwelled difference. This invisible thread kept groups cautious, bound them to caution as though it were a ritual of life itself. The environment reflected this lesson, for the boundary between light and shadow often distorted vision, making figures shift in form. Fire bent faces into unfamiliar expressions. Twilight blurred familiarity until recognition snapped too late. All of these reinforced the ancient learning that what appeared familiar might suddenly be revealed as not fully belonging. The uncanny valley was not imagined, but taught by endless rehearsals of fear and relief. For us today, the faces of those vanished peoples exist only in reconstructions, in bone and speculation. But for our ancestors, they were real in breath and in movement, stepping beside streams, pausing at the mouths of caves, carrying tools, raising children, their lives pressed like faint fingerprints onto our own, through distant memory of genes and deeper memory of instinct. And though most of these branches faded to silence, their shadows walk beside us still, not in the streets, but in our minds, stirring unease at the mannequin, the doll, the shifting mask of technology, echoes of encounters so ancient we cannot place them, but so important that their impression never dimmed. Thus we begin to see how the uncanny valley is not a quirk of modern machines, but a legacy of countless encounters across an Earth crowded with cousins, familiar yet fractured, a legacy of survival written quietly into the flesh of who we are. When we think of prehistory, it is tempting to picture a lonely world, one species rising alone to meet the challenges of nature. But the Earth was never so quiet, never so singular. Instead, it was crowded, textured with many branches of humankind, each one carrying fire, each one shaping stone, each one leaving footprints beside rivers and across valleys. It was within this crowdedness that the sensation of the uncanny took root most firmly. Our ancestors lived not as isolated figures, but as one thread in a woven fabric of many human-like beings, each group navigating life through hunting, gathering, and the ceaseless rhythm of survival. Yet, when these groups crossed paths, what was reflected was haunting. Resemblance sharpened by dissonance. The almost, but not entirely, the familiar tinged with strangeness. Consider the moment of encountering strangers across a clearing, their figures rising with the same posture, their eyes not dull, but active, their steps purposeful, yet their bodies marked by otherness, broader hands, sloping brows, jaws that carried different shape. No predator could unsettle in quite this way, for animals belonged to their realm, but these were reflections, and thus they touched unease at its deepest level. In every meeting, decisions carved themselves into instinct, sometimes to fight, sometimes to flee, sometimes perhaps to share and learn, but never to forget. The memory of likeness fractured by difference pressed itself into the nervous system of humanity. No encounter left without imprint, and across thousands of seasons that imprint hardened into inheritance. The uncanny valley, as we feel it when gazing at a doll or digital image, is a faint echo of these ancient judgments, a body's reminder whispered across eons, urging distance from the not quite right. And so our perception of faces has always been more than perception alone. It has been survival. Around fire, stories transformed memory into teaching parents, conveying to children the importance of recognizing the line between kin and other. Perhaps stories painted these others as spirits of mountains, or people of the caves, or shadow dwellers who lived nearby but could not be trusted. The details evaporated with time, but the pulse of those stories remained. Imagine children in those camps, eyes wide as flames cast shapes on cave walls, listening not simply for entertainment, but for direction. The uncanny was rehearsed there as caution, reinforced even before one faced it outside. Thus what had begun as instinct became tradition, and tradition in turn became culture. Another way the valley carved itself into permanence. This legacy would ripple far beyond the Stone Age, for in later centuries, myths across continents still told of beings close to us, but not quite smaller. Folk in hills, giants in mountains, shadowed people, moving at night. And while science cannot prove they were direct memories, the resonance alone suggests that impressions lived far longer than the bodies that first gave them form. In this way, the uncanny valley becomes less a modern curiosity and more a window, a lens through which one can glimpse the crowded world that gave rise to humanity. And in that crowdedness lies the haunting reminder: we were not alone. Perhaps we have never truly been alone, for the shapes of those others still linger, preserved not in living presence, but in the quiet recoil within us, when familiarity bends ever so slightly into strangeness. When looking back across those vanished ages, it becomes clear that the uncanny valley is not an invention of modernity, but a landscape of feeling that has always shadowed us. For the old world was dense with mirrors of humanity, every branch resembling our own, yet singing with a slightly different note. It was within this chorus that the instinct of unease was sharpened on the savannas of Africa. The sight of other hominins moving in the heat haze must have been both comforting and disturbing. To recognize upright posture at such a distance, to know immediately that this was not an antelope or lion, but something far closer. And yet, as the figure moved nearer, the dissonance would become clear. The jawline sharper, the proportions irregular, the face heavy with unfamiliar patterns. Your pulse would rise, not because of open threat, but because the spirit of recognition had stumbled. This tension, repeated over generations, carved a deep and invisible valley in the human psyche. Not a valley in soil or stone, but in perception, a channel through which experience flowed, guiding every decision of trust or retreat. When one's survival lay in distinguishing kin from near kin, truth from illusion, each choice bore the weight of life itself. Imagine wandering at dusk, sky fading into embers of purple and silver, and spotting firelight flickering across a slope. The warmth and brightness evoke comfort, the knowledge of another. Living presence, but the closer your group draws, the quicker the breath becomes, for voices you hear in the distance are not quite shaped like yours, and silhouettes cast upon stone are broader, heavier, subtly wrong fires. promise warmth, but they also promise others, and others are always risk. In those moments, the uncanny feelings shielded them, whispered restraint, taught distance, even when curiosity pulled toward closeness. Those instincts did not vanish when species faded. They remained as guardians inside us, transmitted like unspoken instructions, written into the nervous system of every child born after. Even in culture itself, these reverberations appeared. Stories passed through countless generations began to speak not only of animals or storms, but of beings who lived almost as we lived, beings close yet veiled, dwarfs, giants, forest spirits, little people or shapeshifters. What we now call myth may be less invention and more translation, a soft retelling of unease imprinted on perception, polished into narrative over centuries. Notice how across continents myths carry similar rhythms. The unknown beings are always close, yet somehow fractured. They share our form, but blur the border of humanity. They appear at boundaries of forests, rivers, or cave mouths, places where the known world surrenders to the unknown. These stories may reflect no single memory, but the echo of many a chorus of encounters blurred into one language of caution. And when we today experience that sudden shiver at a mask too human-like, or a digital face subtly broken, what awakens is not anxiety from machines, but the revived instinct of thousands of encounters past. The valley calls us still, not as warning against technology, but as reminder of our coexistence with shadows carved from the same clay. Neighbors long vanished who nonetheless carved enduring impressions in the heart of humanity. The uncanny feeling did not need explanations. It was not a belief to be taught with words. It was a sensation woven into the minds of our ancestors long before language had shaped itself into stories. It arrived in the quickening of pulse when silhouettes emerged at the forest edge, in the quiet recoil when a face caught the firelight at the wrong angle, in the uneasy quiet stirred by the presence of those who carried likeness, fractured by difference. Think of how delicate the recognition of a face must have been in ancient times, when families gathered in caves where only fire offered illumination. Faces flickered, stretched, distorted by shadow. Yet within those moments, children learned to read identity, to know one figure as kin and another as other, each lesson reinforced by caution, the impulse to tighten the circle, to lean closer to what was known, to shrink from what carried confusion. Unease, then, was less a failing than a compass, guiding survival with subtlety, perhaps preventing conflict with beings who might overpower, perhaps steering away from paths where competition for food would be fatal. The uncanny valley was not an error in perception, but a quiet guardianship of life itself. Over time, these encounters accumulated until they became layered into culture. Perhaps some stories grew into songs or rituals, whispered by fire to children whose minds were still pliable and open. Some tales likely exaggerated, filling space with spirits and creatures. Yet at their core sat the memory of meetings with near kin, encounters too complex to categorize, encounters that shaped the texture of human thought. Archaeologists uncover tools of Neanderthals and note their similarity to ours, but for the people who once faced them, that similarity would have been disturbing, a mirror of skill, a reminder that humanity was not unique in thought. To watch another being strike flint, prepare fire, and shape tools would have unsettled, for those skills had long been bound to identity itself. To find them mirrored was to find oneself disrupted. And what of smaller kin, those compact figures whose frames appeared at streams or in forest thickets, not towering like Neanderthals, but haunting for opposite reason? The diminutive stature pulling the instincts of recognition into confusion, adults shaped like children, walking with deliberate motion, perhaps gazing with intelligence unclouded. Here again the uncanny thrived, twisting perception, forcing the mind to question the boundaries of human likeness. The uncanny valley deepens wherever the edges of familiarity blur, whether through face, proportion, or movement, and in that ancient world of diverse humankind, such blurring was not rare. It was the rhythm of living, every encounter reinforcing the instinct. every hesitation pressing it deeper into inheritance. So when we feel our stomach shift today at a puppet, almost alive at a machine, smiling with glassy eyes, it is no accident. It is the echo of a long-buried instinct, a fragment of memory, older than any written story, rising in response to shadows that once walked close beside us. Thus the uncanny is not foreign. It is family, not invention, but inheritance, one of the few sensations to travel unbroken across the gulf of ages, reminding us quietly, relentlessly, that survival is written not only through strength, but through the wisdom of unease. As generations passed, the landscapes of Earth shifted, glaciers advanced and withdrew, forests spread and retreated, seas rose and fell. But one thing that remained constant was the persistence of difference dwelling alongside familiarity. The world was never a stage occupied by only one kind of human. It was a mosaic, a constellation of beings who each carried their own ways of living, all of them familiar enough to stir recognition, yet altered enough to deepen unease. This was not the neat separation we prefer when looking backwards, where books place species into clean names and clear divisions out there in the world. Life was blurred, overlapping, intertwined camps might be deserted only to reveal tools strikingly like one's own kill. Discovered marked by techniques uncannily close evidence left behind that another human-like being had been there, unseen, and that recognition was both breathtaking and shivering. For our ancestors, these signs must have been more powerful than we can conceive. Tools pressed into soil told them that elsewhere there lived others, who shaped flint, who carried fire and knowledge parallels to their lives, mirrored just out of sight, uncanny, perhaps more in absence than presence, because the realization of being mirrored unsettled identity itself. If another could do as we did, what then truly set us apart? Picture the long silence of dusk, when hunters returned to caves carrying hides and meat, tired but triumphant. In the soil near the mouth of the cave, they find scattered flakes of stone, not their own making, too recent to be ancient, too familiar to be from beasts. The heart would tighten as the mind whispered, others have been here, others close enough to leave behind their skill, close enough to breathe the same air. This was not curiosity. It was warning, carried in objects as surely as in encounters. The uncanny valley arises not only from faces, but from gestures, artifacts, the echoes of behavior. When another performs movements, so like ours, yet wears a form slightly altered, we step back. Hesitation rules, not from reasoned judgment, but from ancient pulse. This reaction guided survival just as surely as strength in the hunt. And from that caution grew distance, distance between fires, between shelters, even between worlds of imagination, each species living its rhythm while feeling the weight of near likeness pressing from beyond. A presence that could not be erased, but held at quiet arm's length. Over time, the instinct was etched deeper, one generation to the next. Like the passing down of skills to chip stone or twist fibers, unease became part of the inheritance. So much so that even as the other species faded from view, the instinct refused to vanish. It lingered on like a memory our bodies could not forget. When we today look upon a wax figure in a museum, or notice something strange in the reflection of a mannequin's gaze, the quickening pulse may feel unmoored from logic. Yet it is the echo of these ancient recognitions, whispers of camps long gone, echoes of cousins long silent, lingering still in the folds of human perception. The uncanny valley, then, is less a phenomenon of the modern age and more a shadow thrown across the millennia, a shadow reminding us that the story of humanity is not one of solitude, but of coexistence, proximity, and the lingering unease of reflections walking just beyond the circle of firelight. When imagining those long-vanished days, one must remember that fear was not always a roar, not always claws or teeth. Often it was a presence unseen, a figure at the edge of the forest, the flicker of fire. Across a distant hillside, the uncanny did not leap, it lingered, a quiet current, moving beneath every step, and this undercurrent shaped the entire rhythm of life. The mind of early humans became a map of signals, Trained to notice the misplaced detail, the movement that almost fit, the outline that almost belonged, survival was never simply about chasing prey or escaping predators. It was about the discipline of reading difference, of feeling unease in time to create distance. And thus unease itself became a survival tool, invisible yet powerful. On coastlines where waves broke endlessly against rock, clans moved in search of shellfish and driftwood. But imagine stepping across sand and finding footprints pressed into the damp earth, footprints shaped like your own, standing with all the weight of humanity, yet curiously different, the toes spaced at odd angles, the stride slightly shorter, the depth in the sand telling of a body carved differently. In such discoveries, the uncanny burned sharp, a recognition disrupted at its core. These encounters could not always be explained, for language itself was young and often clumsy, and so the feeling was passed down not in words, but in practice. Warnings taught with gestures, with the sharp tightening of a parent's arm around the child, or the hushed stillness that filled a group when distance fires were noticed across a dark plain. The uncanny was as much in education as tool-making, as real as hunger, as essential as water. Even as cooperation sometimes bridged the gap as exchanges of food or materials occurred, the underlying unease persisted, acting as a silent thread pulling tight. Whenever boundaries blurred, the more alike another species appeared, the stronger. The tension grew because sameness without belonging unsettled identity, and identity was the fabric of survival itself. Perhaps it is no coincidence that many of the oldest myths echo this tension. Stories of hidden people living in mountains, of dwarfs dwelling in caves, of shadow folk who look like us, but carry strangeness. Such tales may be the distilled memory of ancient encounters, not recorded as history, but fossilized as story, polished across centuries of retelling, until their origin was forgotten, but their essence remained. The uncanny valley is not simply about faces. It is about the wider recognition of humanness misplaced, when gestures, tools, stature, or movements were close enough to resemble, but far enough to disturb. And lived within this contrast was an emotion so deeply etched that it became eternal, surviving longer than the beings who inspired it. So even as millennia erased the footsteps of those others, even as forests reclaimed their caves and rivers swept away their bones, the impulse they stirred remained alive within us, not in names or memories, but in the shadowed instinct of caution that flickers each time we encounter a likeness that feels too near, yet not entirely our own. The uncanny taught itself not with words, but with impressions that could not be erased. Once felt to see something close to familiar, yet bent in proportion, left a mark deeper than spoken teaching ever could, settled into the flesh as surely as scars. And it guided life long after the moment had passed. On the grassy steppes, where the horizon stretched open and endless, bands of humans moved with the herds, yet they were not the only ones. In scattered places other hands cast stone flakes to the ground, other minds kindled fire, other feet pressed trails into the soil. And when the two threads of life met across this vast canvas, unease followed close behind. The face was always the first sign, for the face wields unmatched power and recognition, and anything slightly broken in its symmetry pulled instinct like a string drawn taut. There is something haunting in that moment, when a hunter might glimpse another figure kneeling across a stream, the reflection shivering in the current, the shoulders framed like his own kin, the posture so close, yet the head turns an angle too heavy, the brows shadow the eyes too strongly, the jaw wide and blunt. In that tiny distortion, the heartbeat rises, the silence bends, and unease becomes truth. These countless fleeting encounters shaped an instinct that perhaps saved more lives than confrontation itself, for it warned without violence, it stirred distance before danger could erupt. And so while many tools chipped from stone were passed down, so too was the invisible tool of unease, waiting behind every glance that did not match expectation, a tool carried forward into children, born long after the encounters had ceased. Over time, whole groups of humans vanished, their fire pits grew cold, their voices slipped into silence, Yet their strangeness lingered inside the memory of those who outlasted them, translated into tale, into myth, into ways of teaching children about boundaries and belonging. Perhaps entire traditions arose first from these whispers. Long before gods or kings were named, there was already the figure at the forest edge who looked almost human, but not entirely safe. Even art may have carried this weight, for some of the earliest carvings lean heavily toward animals, bison, mammoths, birds, creatures of strength and sustenance. It may be telling that faces too human-like are scarce, as if even in creativity there was an instinctive pull to avoid pressing the uncanny into permanence. Perhaps to carve such a likeness risked not praise but unease, awakening the same shadow that stirred in real encounters. This is why the uncanny valley reaches beyond technology, beyond puppets or machines. It is an inheritance from landscapes where identity was tested again and again, where belonging was a matter of survival, and where the face of humanity was more varied than we often imagine. To live in that world was to live with constant mirrors, slightly cracked, to watch yourself reflected again and again in shadows that were near but not you. And although we now walk alone upon the earth as the final surviving branch, their ghostly presence travels with us still, found not in caves or mountains, but hidden within perception, arising in that fleeting recoil when closeness feels fractured, reminding us softly of the world that once was crowded, and of the instincts it left behind to guard us through the ages. The uncanny feeling was not merely a reaction. It became a rhythm that beat quiet and steady in the background of human life. For those who lived among the ashes of many fires, the instinct was as much a part of survival as hunger or thirst. Day after day, the world reminded them that they were not alone, and every reminder carried both familiarity and fracture. On open plains, hunters tracked the giant herds. Yet beside the herds, the footprints of others appeared, indistinguishable at a glance, but carrying differences upon closer study, longer strides, deeper impressions, where legs were shaped by denser muscle, footprints mapping the lives of others who lived the same landscape yet belonged to another kin. These trails etched unease not only into the step of the hunter, but into the step of his children, who learned early that such patterns were signals that told them to draw close to family, to guard the fire, to remain aware. Even small things became vessels of fear. A stranger's tool found beside the riverbed, sharp and finely split like their own flint, but touched by hands that were not theirs. The object itself seemed to carry presence, as though the face of an absent other clung to the edge of stone. Such discoveries struck deeper than any encounter, for they conveyed likeness without presence, a ghost of otherness embedded in materials. This constant tension twisted itself into culture, making its home not only in reflex, but in imagination. Around the fire, the feeling was dressed in story, transformed into figures and myths, stretched into symbols, passed down through words children could remember. And although those tales eventually blurred into legends of spirits, giants, or shadow folk, what beat behind them was much older, a signal felt across generations. Think of dusk, when hunters watched the ridge line against fading sky, the silhouette of movement crossing the ridge, its form upright, confident in step, human in posture, yet unmistakably not one of their own. Perhaps no words could describe what precisely was different, yet difference was undeniable, and in that difference lay the whisper of danger. It is here that we see how the uncanny valley shaped more than perception. It shaped boundaries, telling humans where to end trust, where to draw a line between embrace and distance, perhaps even forming the framework of community itself. For what is belonging if not trust in faces that stir no unease, in movements that reassure rather than fracture, in voices that reflect familiarity? Over centuries, this rhythm became inheritance, settling deep into the architecture of perception, carried unconsciously across thousands of lifetimes until it rests quietly in us still. And now, when we feel unease in the presence of figures almost alive yet stiff, or images almost breathing yet false, we are tasting the ghost of those ancient moments, Survival has long since shifted into new forms. Yet the uncanny valley remains steady as one of the oldest and most faithful instincts. Its origins not in machines or modern illusions, but in the breath and step of others who once lived near us, cousins now silent, yet whose presence wrote itself into the very fabric of our mind. The uncanny valley was not born in a single meeting, nor in one dramatic clash. It was cultivated like earth, pressed by countless footsteps, shaped by repetition across thousands of seasons. Each glance at a stranger's brow, each pause at a foreign footprint, every unease folded into instinct until it no longer felt like choice, but like truth itself. Our ancestors did not need names for this sensation. It was simply part of life, as natural as the dawn or the rhythm of rain. When children first opened their eyes to the world, they were cradled within circles of familiarity. Their parents, their kin, the faces that calmed and reassured, but always beyond the circle lingered others, beings whose likeness stirred confusion. And children learned through every shared silence that difference was more than surface. It was signal. Consider a band traveling along a wide plain, the grass tall as a chest, the sky open and rimmed with gold. They move as a group, alert but unafraid. Then suddenly in the distance, another line of figures emerges, upright, carrying themselves with the same posture, faces unseen but movements clear. At first the heart might swell with recognition, neighbors, kin, but then the smallest fracture is noticed. Shoulders too broad, stride too heavy, heads shaped just differently enough. Unease overtakes hope in one quiet rush. The group halts, and the valley opens invisibly between them. Objects too carried this feeling. Stone shards revealed in stream beds, bones splintered by familiar methods, evidence of intelligence not fully their own. The uncanny was present in absence as well as encounter, in the discoveries that whispered, someone else is here, someone not us, but close enough to unsettle. In this way, even silence spoke of unease. And over time, humans, ever the storytellers, began to weave feeling into narrative, dressing the uncanny in forms that drifted down through generations as myths. The hidden people in forests, the shadowy ones at the edge of firelight, the not quite human but close enough to terrify. The roots of these stories reached deep into soil long predating writing. Built from centuries of perception, before memory could be bound into script, even ritual may have been shaped by this instinct. Fire circles that drew boundaries against darkness. Paint on skin to mark identity strongly. Clear lines made so that kin would not be mistaken for other. The uncanny valley did not only unsettle, it inspired creation. It pressed humans to clarify themselves, to express their belonging more sharply in symbols, in ornaments, in the shared gestures of identity. And so, when we feel the strangeness of a wax figure or the subtle disturbance of a machine face, we are not reacting to novelty. We are remembering across blood and bone. We are following the ancient script that told us to step back when closeness blurred with strangeness, to guard ourselves from reflections not quite our own. The uncanny stays with us because it was never separate from our survival. It was companion to our early steps through the world, a quiet shadow instructing us even when it had no name carried forward, faithfully not by words or laws, but by survival itself. Though bones and tools crumble into earth, though voices fade, though fire pits are swallowed by soil and stone, what endures is the imprint they left upon the minds of those who lived beside them. For while the other branches of humankind vanished one by one, the feeling they stirred survived. Unease became the inheritance stronger than language, stronger than memory, stronger even than blood. Across glacial plains, our ancestors must have carried this instinct as surely as they carried their stone blades. Each encounter with a stranger's face, reminding them again of the thin line between familiarity and threat. For no weapon strikes so deeply as recognition fractured. When what you see is so close to kin, but not entirely true, the body reacts before thought, tightening, warning, preparing for danger. This was the gift the uncanny offered, and though it unsettled, it also preserved. Some encounters undoubtedly ended in violence, yet others may have been marked by quiet exchanges of skill or mating between groups. Even then, unease lingered, binding relationships with subtle caution, trust strained, faces studied too intently, gestures questioned with sharpness. The uncanny never fully dissolved, even in moments of closeness. Rather, it remained like a low hum beneath the surface, constant and unmoving. Over the ages, this hum found reflection in the stories humanity clung to. Across continents emerged tales of giants in the mountains, of little people haunting forests, of shadow figures who lived beside families, yet never fully within them. Stories not born in isolation, but echoes resonating from shared experiences scattered through early life on Earth. And when these stories survived into myth, children repeated them, not knowing that hidden in each tale was instinct itself, masked as wonder and warning. Even as the last of these shadows faded, their trace continued to ripple through the way humans defined themselves. Art carried their ghost, music may have echoed their memory, and rituals sharpened the boundary between us and them. Symbols and patterns revealed not only creativity, but also the deep need to declare, we belong, and you do not. This was not malice, but survival. The marking of borders in culture, just as in soil. Imagine the meaning of fire beyond its warmth, though it cooked food and guarded against predators. Fire may also have been a circle of protection against the not quite human light to reveal faces and prove they were truly known, not half known. The glow that reassured and silenced the anxiety of encountering shadows made strange. When families leaned toward firelight, they leaned not only into warmth, but into certainty. And here lies the haunting power of the uncanny valley, that it has never been simply about discomfort, but about safety. It was an instinct calibrated in an age of reflections, when we looked into the world and saw ourselves returned in images not fully our own, and survival depended on stepping back in time. Thus, even now, across thousands of years, when our bodies stiffen at a puppet's glassy gaze, or our hearts murmur at a nearly human machine, we are not responding to invention, but to remembrance, to ghosts of recognition, gone wrong, to the shadows of cousins who walked with us, fed beside us, drank from the same streams, and carved caution into our very bones. The uncanny valley was more than a fleeting sensation. It was a quiet architect shaping the foundations of human identity itself. For to know who you are requires knowing who you are not. And the earliest lessons upon this truth were taught not by words, but through encounters with faces that mirrored yet diverged, close enough to stir the warmth of recognition, twisted just enough to stir suspicion. Imagine the earliest settlements. Small clusters of families huddled together under skins stretched across wooden frames. Smoke curling upward into chill air, the circle small and fragile against the enormity of wilderness within the circle faces. Or reassuring one glance, and the mind eased for kinship was inscribed in familiarity outside the circle, though lay the possibility of other fires, other circles, other beings who may have looked disturbingly close to home. Across valleys, the glow of distant flames may have appeared against the night, calling silently, whispering that others survived nearby. Curiosity tugged at the heart. Yet unease rose to temper it. They are like us, but not us. Here the uncanny valley sealed itself not only in instinct, but in the choices communities made to turn inward, to guard their borders, to keep myths at the edge of firelight alive as reminders. Some may wonder why stories of spirits and outsiders appear in almost every culture, tales of beings who resemble humans yet dwell in caves, mountains, or dark woods, why such tales arise so consistently, even across continents never connected in antiquity. Perhaps it is because the origins are not inventions but echoes. The strange inheritance of encounters replayed so many times across the ancient world that unease became a shared human language written across continents without ink or script. And there is poetry in the thought that while other species may have shaped tools and fire, it was this very uncanny feeling that gave our ancestors an edge, sharpening not the blade of stone, but the blade of perception. When the choice was between trust and caution, it was better to trust the shiver in the chest. Hesitation was survival, and survival was the river that carried our line forward when others vanished into silence. Picture again the faces, their brows heavy, their eyes deeper under shadow, their frames shorter or larger, moving with intent. It is unsettling, not because they are monstrous, but because they are so very near. And this nearness is the wound. It is the fracture that keeps the mind alert, the moment that forces the body to remember difference. When everything appears almost correct, except for details that do not align fully, that moment is the valley. And so across thousands of years of observation, repetition carved the instinct deeper, until it was less a conscious thought and more an unconscious current moving through every glance. A river flowing silently beneath awareness, feeding generations as they learned boundaries through unease. Even when the cousins of humanity were gone, their presence remained in the unsettlement we still hold, an absence that acts like presence, a memory that carries no words, only pulse. And because it came not through stories alone, but through instinct itself, it could not be erased. It outlived the species to whom it once referred. Thus, when we recoil slightly at an imitation face today, we do not step back because of wires, glass, or paint. We step back because long ago the earth was not ours alone, because eyes, unlike ours, once looked into ours, and something deep within us never stopped remembering. There is a kind of beauty in the thought that the uncanny valley is not born of malice, but of memory, not hatred, but hesitation. It is the soft resistance of a body reminding itself of old truths, truths written not into scrolls, but into bone and breath, when the world was a neighborhood crowded with kin who were almost mirrors, and whose reflections demanded caution. Picture a canyon cut deep by river water, its walls carved for thousands of seasons. From above, the passage looks like a single line, yet within, countless details mark its unique character. So too with humanity. When viewed distantly through time, we imagine ourselves singular, the only human thread surviving. Yet closer inspection shows many tributaries, many cousins winding near us, each one carrying a slightly altered reflection, each one shaping unease through their difference. It was in this closeness where strangeness took root. For predators like lions or wolves needed no uncanny valley. They were other in every sense their threat. Clear their danger, obvious what unsettled far more, was the human-like face gazing back, the posture, indistinguishable in twilight, the tool-making hands. Not unlike ours, it was the shadow of sameness, fractured into distortion, that carved unease deeper than any fang could ever carve. Consider the stillness of a dark cave, the walls slick with dampness, the fire burning low, children huddled close against their elders. Suddenly from deeper within comes a faint echo of movement. Not beast, not wind, but the steady rhythm of feet crossing stone. Those steps could belong to kin, but the mind prepares for the possibility that they do not. And this hesitation is sharper than fear itself. The valley appears in every heartbeat that waits for recognition and praise it is not betrayed. Across ages, such moments gathered like drops upon stone etching lines across the architecture of the mind, flowing into instinct, passed through generations to be human, became not only to walk upright, to shape tools, or to speak with voice, but also to sense difference with uncanny intensity, to recoil instinctively from the face that is almost ours, but carries fracture. Perhaps this is why the earliest symbolic artworks lean inward toward abstraction, toward form and meaning rather than direct likeness. For to bring into permanence the face of others might have unsettled the artists themselves. Too close, too familiar, too fractured. They may have avoided such depictions not for lack of ability, but for preservation of calm, leaving instead the contours of animals and spirits, easier to settle into stone and pigment. This unease continued its migration across centuries, disguised as stories, carried as tradition. It became part of how humans explain the world to themselves. Tales of other peoples lingering in mountains, rivers, caverns, never fully vanishing, never fully embraced, woven into the edges of culture like shadows you cannot step upon, but which always lengthen at dusk. Even today, when we see a face broken by distortion, a mask nearly human, a puppet almost alive, our bodies remember the canyon carved by these countless drops. Our minds read echoes of footsteps in caves that no longer exist. Our instincts whisper reminders from meetings we no longer consciously recall, but which shape the fabric of what it means to survive as human. The uncanny valley speaks as much through silence as through presence. Its origins whisper, not only in the face-to-face meeting of kin and other, but in the held breath of distance, in the recognition of traces and signs, footprints pressed too deeply into ash, stone blades left half-formed, fire pits blackened long before discovery. Absence itself could stir the same shiver as a gaze. For the mind knew that what was once here was too close for comfort, too close for certainty. The ancestors who moved across these lands could not ignore such signs, even if the beings themselves remained unseen. Because familiarity without connection unsettles more than difference ever could. When a predator left claw marks across a tree, it was a warning clear in its otherness. But when another human-like trail appeared, a handprint on stone, too broad or too narrow, a sequence of tools skilled but not made by kin, it tested the boundaries of identity itself. And in those quiet recognitions, the uncanny valley deepened further. Perhaps this is why boundary space became so essential. Fire circles guarded not only against animals, but against intrusion from unknown faces. Caves chosen carefully with sightlines toward open approaches, gathering places fixed with vigilance. Unease trained humans not only to distrust the near, but to design life in ways that reinforced safety. It was instinct as architecture, instinct shaping not just feeling, but living. Within these daily choices, culture itself took form. Storytelling pressed unease into words more vividly than silence could, shaping legends of those who lingered just beyond the horizon, close to us, yet not us. Perhaps children grew up with fear, gentled by these tales, learning not to wander far, learning to see reflection without assuming kinship. The uncanny passed down as guidance softened by myth. And because truth becomes harder to hold than symbol, the memory of those others slipped steadily into story. Yet the body remembered, even when the names were forgotten, even when the species themselves faded, the instinct walked strong. Imagine again the flicker of early art, pigments pressed to stone walls, lines curving into the body of animals, herds of deer or bison captured with flowing grace. Yet the human form appears abstracted, altered, never quite full. Why did artists avoid the exact face, the clear portrait? Perhaps they knew too well the unease that familiarity almost delivered. Perhaps committing too recognizable a likeness risked unsettling those who looked upon it. The uncanny valley may have limited representation as much as survival, carving silence in image just as it did in story. In time, the others vanished, Neanderthals silenced in caves, Denisovans buried without record, Flores people gone with their islands. And yet their absence did not mean the closing of the valley, for absence becomes its own echo, leaving imprints in the nervous system, guiding emotions far removed from the world that created them. Survival thrives on memory, even when its reason has dissolved. Thus, when we recoil today at a doll with lifeless eyes or a digital face shifting just off rhythm, we are not encountering novelty. We are walking paths forged by ancestors who once lived in a crowded human world, who sat by fire as unease, whispered from the shadows who carried that whisper forward for us, still unfading, unbroken. To understand the uncanny valley is to understand that our history is not only written in bones or artifacts, but in feelings, for emotion can outlast stone. Unease can survive where caves collapse and rivers erase. What endured across the endless centuries was not merely flint or shelter, but the unspoken inheritance of perception. The body's whisper to itself that closeness is not always safety. A predator is easy to name, but it is not predators that held the deepest grip on memory. It is what was nearest to us, the cousins who stood across fires. their movements echoing our own, their gestures recognizable, their shadows too. Close to ignore our fear was not carved most deeply by fangs, but by mirrors fractured ever so slightly. Picture a valley rimmed by hills, mist drifting low to the ground, in the fading light, a band of hunters. Cross it carrying spears, quiet in their steps. The air still, then upon the opposite ridge, a figure appears. Upright, steady firelight glinting from tools carried at its side. To the eye, it could almost be family. But as the distance narrows, unease rises, not an enemy easily defined, but a reflection twisted into strangeness. And in that moment the valley opens wide, though no stream cuts the earth. From countless moments, such as these, came the shaping of instinct, not through clashes, alone, but through hesitations, through pauses, through the still hours, when families debated whether to approach or to keep away, and though the words faded, the feelings survived as stubborn as bone turned to fossil. Perhaps this is why human culture leans so heavily into markers of belonging, necklaces carved from shells, pigments streaked upon skin, bodies painted with signs to declare, we are us, not them. The uncanny demanded such clarification, demanded that lines be drawn clear, that difference be marked deliberately, that children understand not only who to trust, but who to fear. And in time, myths grew around this fear, for what could not be explained must still be named. Thus emerged stories of forest dwellers, of mountain people, of figures who look like us but remain outsiders. They became spirits, they became tricksters, they became warnings and lessons. Each story a fossil of unease, polished until it gleamed with imagination. Even now one can feel this connection when reading such myths, how consistent the themes remain across distant lands and unlinked cultures. Beings like us, yet not us. Beings who linger beside families, but never within them. It is as though all humanity remembered together, without communication, because all humanity once lived among near reflections and was shaped by the same pulse of unease. So when faces in our present world disturb us, faces crafted from wax, faces molded by machines, faces not truly alive, yet almost breathing, the sensation comes, not from novelty, but from survival, as deepest call. It is not new, it is very, very old, the echo of firelit stories of footprints in unfamiliar sand, of strange tools found in caves. Unease surviving as the most honest memory. The uncanny valley did not arise as a curiosity. It was born as a necessity. It was not decoration on the mind, but foundation, the instinctual distance that allowed survival in a world layered with kin and strangers alike. Every encounter sharpened that distance, until caution became as natural as breath, woven tightly into the blood of generations. Consider a family sheltering in a cave during storm, rain falling like stone against the trees outside, flame burning low in the pit, shadows banding harsh upon the walls, as thunder rolled and lightning cracked. A movement stirred in the entrance. A figure stooped in posture, like their own, its hair clumped wet, its hands carrying bone, its face, hidden at first by the strike of light. In that instant before recognition formed, unease swept through them. Their pulse knew before thought, this is like me, but not me. This is almost kin, but the fracture is sharp enough to demand retreat. Such moments would not be explained. They could only be felt, and feeling became the more enduring teacher. Across thousands of generations, encounters locked themselves to marrow, each shiver transformed into a whispered warning passed forward unseen. The valley grew not only from living encounters, but from the traces they left behind, skulls discovered by accident in earth. Perhaps their ridges felt wrong to the touch. Perhaps their proportions twisted what the eye expected. To stumble upon bones of another, who was clearly human-like, but not quite right, must have sent its own current of unease curling down the spine. The uncanny was present, even in death, echoing from the shapes left behind. Ritual may have been born at this edge, the care of our own dead sharpened in contrast against discomfort for the bodies of others. The respect and belonging lavished upon kin became a rejection of the uncanny. Burial sites may have drawn borders not only against time, but against strangeness, announcing that these are ours, and that those beyond the border, though they resemble, use are not to be gathered, not to be mourned as we mourn ourselves. The uncanny valley then was not simply a feeling, it was a teacher that directed practice. A current that urged humans to define themselves ever more tightly against the almost perhaps pushing our kind toward. The elaboration of art of language of symbol, so that difference could be marked clearly. Identities solidified, belonging clarified, so that unease would not consume but guide. It is telling that long after the other humans vanished, the myths persisted across oceans and continents. People told and retold of dwarfs in caves, giants in mountain passes, hidden tribes that came by night, tales dressed in culture, but born of instinct, stories repeating the same truth. The greatest danger is not in the beast entirely unlike us, but in the neighbor whose face is nearly our own. Thus, when modern faces crafted by machines disturb us, when wax figures glance back too closely, what we feel is not error, but inheritance, an instinct unbroken by millennia. A lesson folded into our very existence, that closeness is not always comfort, and that survival begins where recognition falters. The uncanny valley has always been more than a sensation of the present. It is a bridge across time, carrying with it the weight of countless encounters, each step through history, pressing new layers upon the same foundation. It is strange to think that people today, shifting uncomfortably at the sight of a doll or pausing uneasily before a machine face, are continuing a story that began beside rivers lined with stone and in caves where firelight flickered on damp walls. Our ancestors did not choose this instinct, they inherited it, just as surely as we inherit eyes or hands. It was carved into us by circumstance, by proximity to beings who looked close enough to belong, and yet close enough to betray, and this tension wrote its warning so deeply that no language could erase it. Picture a group of wanderers following a trail down into a wooded gorge, the air cool, the canopy blotting much of the light. There, pressed into soil softened by rain, they see not the paw prints of beasts, but the impressions of feet. Feet so familiar, it is as though their own had already been carved into the ground. But when examined closer, the heel is wider, the toes spaced differently, the length somehow not quite right. Unease sweeps over them, for these are not kin, and yet they are far too similar to ignore. The uncanny thrives in such discoveries, demanding acknowledgement of similarity while insisting upon difference. It is a paradox the mind cannot fully solve, a presence that cannot be neatly placed into enemy or kin. And so unease fills the gap like water finds a hollow, shaping generations who lived with its persistence. And because humans are storytellers before they are record keepers, these inexplicable feelings wove their way into oral traditions. One can almost hear the cadence of such a story told, beside low flames, as shadows clung to walls. A tale of strangers who resemble neighbors, but whose steps bring danger. Stories that instructed children, not merely in fact, but in instinct, confirming within them the reaction their bodies already knew. What fascinates most is how widespread such patterns of story became, across continents far distant and cultures divided by oceans. Legends emerged that spoke of not quite humans, of hidden people in forests, of giants or dwarfs or shadow dwellers. Cultural dressings were different, but their essence was the same, perhaps because their seed was planted in the same soil of encounter. Even the earliest symbolic objects may reveal this influence: beads, carvings, pigments that separated one tribe from another, symbols that declared belonging, perhaps sharpened by the knowledge that other beings walked near. So like us, that we needed markers to proclaim difference, to strengthen identity. It was not vanity that drove ornamentation, but the old and quiet guidance of unease. And now, in our modern halls filled with the gaze of wax figures, or in the flicker of digital faces straining toward imitation, we feel again the ripple of that inheritance, the memory of footsteps in damp soil, the memory of strange fires glowing across valleys. Feelings carried longer than bloodlines, longer than bone, stirring us still. The uncanny valley can be thought of as a shadow cast, not by a single moment, but by centuries stretched beyond our imagining. It is the echo of repetition, the way countless encounters stitched one instinct into permanence. For every glance across a stream, every fire glimpsed in the distance, every footprint pressed into ash, the feeling was reinforced, and when strengthened by time, unease became unshakable. In the savannas and the forests, the caves and the frozen plains, humans shared the earth with those who mirrored, but did not match. And every meeting left its trace. Imagine the strain in those cautious moments when survival demanded patience. Hunters frozen in place with spears raised half high, uncertain if the figures they watched were kin or rival. Moments that stretched long enough for the mind to etch them forever across generations. It is said now that we carry fragments of Neanderthal and Denisovan lineages within our own bodies, woven invisibly into our genes, like an imprint left by long-vanished kin. But perhaps more than fragments of bloodline, we carry fragments of memory, emotional fossils, pressed into us by experience. And these fossils endure more clearly than the bones still buried in soil. Consider the child raised in such an environment, learning not from lectures or rules, but from reactions. From the way a parent's arm tightened suddenly when shapes approached at twilight. From how the camp grew quiet when unfamiliar voices drifted across the valley. From the hush that descended when a stranger's face flickered through firelight and proved to be not fully right. These unspoken lessons formed the foundation of instinct, reminding the young long before they reached adulthood that safety lay in hesitation. And thus hesitations guided communities as surely as skills did in forming where they wandered, where they avoided. Which gatherings ended in closeness and which tightened into silence. These hesitations then grew into myths decorating instinct with story, placing masks of imagination on feelings too deep to otherwise communicate. Whether these masks took form as giants, dwarfs, or forest dwellers, a whole carried the same root. The uneasy reminder of living among near kin who stood too close to comfort. Art too whispered of these impressions, yet with silence as much as expression. Paintings of animals flourished across stone, depictions of hunts and herds, yet rarely the almost human, rarely the brethren in shadow. Perhaps because committing them to image would have stirred the same recoil their presence did. The uncanny, avoided even in pigment, left its absence as proof that it lingered. Ritual objects may also have grown in answer, carved to affirm identity, painted to sharpen belonging, beads and ochres strung with meaning, perhaps not only to declare beauty, but to anchor selfhood firmly against the storm of likenesses swirling beyond the fire. This impulse shows that the uncanny did not only disturb, it created, driving humans to mark themselves, to make identity unmistakable, to draw lines between us and others, so that unease could not collapse into confusion. And now, long after the others have vanished, this ancient inheritance resurfaces strangely in our modern world when the faces of machines unsettle us, or when a puppet moves with a rhythm just slightly wrong. It is not wires or glass that disturb us, but the oldest instinct still alive. The memory of nights when firelight flickered against faces too close and too strange, pressing lessons into us forever. When trying to imagine the world as it once was, we must remember that familiarity itself carried weight, for every face recognized meant safety, every gesture understood meant belonging. Yet in the same breath, everything almost familiar carved unease. It is this fragile balance between reassurance and distortion that shaped what we now call the uncanny valley. Imagine the quiet of early evening, the sky dipped in violet, the air carrying the smell of smoke and damp earth. A family circles close around their fire, laughter soft, bodies tired from the hunt. Then far off, across a ridge, another flame glimmers, too far to feel, but close enough to see. Hope sparks at first, for other people mean knowledge. Trade, perhaps warmth against loneliness, but then dread creeps. For if their faces prove not quite right, If their words break in strange cadence, an unease will harden quickly into caution. This rhythm must have repeated endlessly, encounters balancing between curiosity and fear, shaping generations who came to trust the warning of their own unease more than the promise of kinship. Because survival treasured caution above longing, the uncanny answer was not always rejection. Sometimes closeness occurred, sometimes the mingling of blood between families, sometimes sharing of tools. But even when intimacy crossed those boundaries, unease remained. It hummed in the background like a distant drum, never fully silent, always reminding that sameness without belonging held its own danger. Artifacts left behind hint at this dual truth. Tools so alike it is difficult today to distinguish which species shaped them. Ornaments strikingly familiar to our own. Evidence of minds capable of wonder, whether or not we call them human. But to those who lived in their presence, each overlap must have unsettled identity itself. It was confronting a mirror that did not confirm, but unsettled. And this burden reshaped both trust and caution. Perhaps it explains why symbols of belonging grew so richly. Pigments streaking the body, beads looping around neck and wrist, marks pressed upon skin with ash or ochre. These were not built from vanity. They were defenses against confusion. Signs shouted across silence that said, "We are us. We are not them." Myths, too, reveal this pattern. So many born from liminal spaces, from the edges of forests, the mouths of caves, the twilight stretches of rivers. For it was at boundaries that encounters most often bloomed. And boundaries, therefore, became charged with power. Stories of spirits and half-humans drift from these spaces, whispered at dusk to keep children safe and to keep memory alive even after the others were gone. And what is most haunting is how consistent these patterns became. From islands far apart, from continents separated by seas, the same stories echo, not of wild beasts, but of near kin. Not of predators easily named, but of beings who live just across the threshold of familiarity. Always close, never fully embraced. The uncanny is heritage expressed in story, long before it took shape as theory. Thus when we today recoil softly at a mask too human-like, or a machine face animated by near-perfect rhythm, we are not engaging a quirk of the present. We are remembering firelight across a ridge long gone, faces by rivers, no longer flowing others, who once walked near us, carrying familiarity twisted by strangeness, stirring unease into a memory humanity has never forgotten. The uncanny valley is not simply a feeling tied to faces. It is a presence woven into the very boundaries of belonging. When we speak of survival in those early ages, we often think of strength or the sharpness of stone. But survival was just as dependent on the invisible architecture of instinct. The hesitation that arrives before recognition, the quiet warning pressed into the heart before danger takes shape. This architecture was carved by countless lives lived among near reflections. Imagine dawn breaking across the cold steppe, frost clinging to the grass, hunters setting out with breath, billowing like smoke. As they crest a ridge, they spot figures moving across the plain, silhouettes upright, backs bent against the wind, tools in hand. For a fleeting moment, it seems like the comfort of familiarity, like other families walking as their own do. Yet unease carves quickly through the illusion. Perhaps the movement is heavier, the arms longer, the skulls framed in ways just outside the rhythm of the expected. And in those small differences, the heart recognizes risk. These moments were repeated endlessly, and slowly, they pressed their shape into the instincts of humankind. Hesitation became second nature, not taught in words, but carried in the silence of gatherings, enforced in the tightening of fireside circles, strengthened in every retelling of tales that warned children never to follow strangers too closely resembling their kin. For though violence played its part, the uncanny valley did not always mean battle. It often meant withdrawal. It meant tribes who turned away from camps that did not feel fully right. It meant distances kept deliberately, boundaries drawn by perception as much as by soil. Such caution must have preserved lives, even when the source of unease was nothing more than difference itself. And here, lies the paradox that the uncanny, though uncomfortable, may have been one of the quiet engines of survival, shaping vigilance into instinct, urging humanity to sharpen the line of identity until it could not be mistaken, painting the body with ochre, adorning with shell or bone, creating culture as signal, so that kin would recognize kin at a glance, and unease could be calmed. Culture, then, was shaped not in isolation, but in shadow of others. Rituals of belonging arose not only to affirm life, but to distinguish it from those who were near yet separate. Fire circles became symbols of protection against the not quite familiar, walls of warmth and light that reassured with every flicker. The uncanny valley also pushed human imagination into myth, for what was uneasy could not simply be left unnamed. It was turned into spirits guarding mountain caves, into small folk dancing in forests, into shadow people who lived beyond rivers. Myths gave form to unease, and in so doing, they gave it permanence. Children carried them forward. Generations polished them until their origins blurred. Yet at their root, they were born of true encounters with faces that unsettled perception. We, modern and singular in our species, live in a world emptied of such shadows. And yet the feeling has never dimmed, it resurfaces. Each time a figure almost human reminds us of the crowdedness once upon the earth. It resurfaces because instinct has no expiry, because memory etched through survival does not fade, because difference unrecognized still sparks. Caution in the heart, long after its reason has passed. There is a certain softness in the way the uncanny valley follows us, like a distant echo you cannot escape. It does not shout, it whispers. And the whisper is stronger than any roar, for throughout prehistory, it guided decisions in ways few other instincts ever could. It told families when to pause, when to hesitate, when to shield the circle of fire more tightly. Its message always the same, that the almost familiar could be more dangerous than the clearly foreign. In the shifting light of dusk, this feeling must have arrived. Often think of hunters finishing their day, dragging branches for firewood, when across the clearing a movement catches. The eye, it is a human-like figure crouched low gathering its own wood, and that heartbeat before recognition. Unease surges, because the shape is right until the details betray it. Perhaps the arms too long, the head proportioned differently, the gaze sharp and unreadable. Those are the fractures that open the valley, even before a word is spoken, even before conflict or cooperation is chosen. Our ancestors could not identify this sensation as we do now. They had no theories, no terms, but they had instinct and instinct shapes. Life as powerfully as memory, perhaps more so entire migrations, may have followed this current. Entire choices of territory, formed by valleys. Abandoned caves avoided places steeped not in direct threat, but in subtle unease, places where traces of other humanoid presence lingered. Footprints pressed into dust, tools half buried, all carrying the same ghostly signal. Over generations, these signals condensed into tradition, stories spun in cautious tones, myths soaring out from realities that had been too raw to describe directly. In forests, mountains, rivers, the uncanny found its voice remade as legend, and through legend it became immortal. The flesh of those others faded, their voices gone, but their impression eternal. So long as a child's mind shivered at a campfire tale, so long as an adult recoiled briefly at a stranger's face, so long as difference stirred recognition before rejection. Art echoed this impression as well, not always in depiction, sometimes in restraint, perhaps too uncanny to carve, perhaps too unsettling to paint. Their absence in depiction speaks as loudly as any image. We see bison charging, mammoth herds thundering, dots and spirals painted as symbols, yet faces like ours, but not ours, are kept to margins or avoided altogether. Their very silence in the caves reveals how powerfully they unsettled those who lived alongside them. And culture itself grew sharper from this edge. Ornaments, pigments, carvings were all signals of belonging, protection against confusion, visible declarations that a face truly belonged within the circle. Perhaps without these signs, Unease might have corroded trust from within, so humans drew their borders ever more clearly, soft at first, then sharper, until difference and belonging were undeniable. Even today, we live inside those sharpened lines, still guided quietly by the inheritance of unease. It is not our intellect that reacts first to the uncanny, but the oldest part of ourselves. The part that remembers what the world once was filled with reflections that unsettled, filled with fires just beyond the ridge. It is the body that remembers, and the body that still teaches. U.S. long after the teachers themselves vanished into silence. The uncanny valley was an inheritance long before it carried a name. It was given not by words, but by evenings filled with stillness, by glances across valleys, by the press of footprints into soil that looked so much like our own, yet were not. It was an inheritance breathed rather than spoken, teaching survival to children whose only task was to watch, to listen, to feel the difference between safe and strange. Think of how delicate the mind of a child must have been in those days, unshaped by story at first, yet molded by the rhythms of their community. Each gesture they observed settled into them as part of the map of life. When parents tensed at shadows in the trees, children felt the tension. When parents drew closer to the circle of fire at the sight of other figures, the lesson was absorbed without instruction, and the valley deepened within them, strengthened by every moment of imitation. The uncanny taught quietly. It guided when to approach and when to retreat. It guided where to settle, which caves to inhabit, which trails to avoid. And though it was never celebrated, it was present in every choice. It lingered at the edges of song and story. It walked with the hunters when they ventured. It spread itself like dusk across entire lifetimes. Above all, it was reinforced by repetition, for these encounters were not rare. They stretched across entire continents, from the cold ridges of Europe, where Neanderthals wandered, to the high mountains where Denisovans breathed air thin and sharp, to the islands where small figures walked with fire in their tiny hands. Across every corner of Earth, humans were not alone, and the uncanny was not exception, but rule. Perhaps this explains the persistence of myth, the way it carried similar threads across oceans, even among cultures who never met, for the uncanny valley was planted everywhere. In Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in every land where our kind survived, the seed of unease sprouted its echo into story, so that a child in one world could grow with the same caution as a child half a world away. Connected not by voice, but by inheritance, we find these stories even in later civilizations. Tales of hidden people in mountains, guardians of dark forests, shadow dwellers seen at the corners of sight, always similar to humans, always divided by one crucial fracture. Their strangeness not foreign, but too close. This current carried memory across centuries. And even when bones and artifacts were forgotten, the pulse of story ensured the uncanny could not fade, and still art spoke its silence. For humans carved what they trusted, painted what they feared less, kept distance and pigment from what unsettled too deeply, in choosing not to etch the uncanny into stone. The ancient artists echoed the restraint of instinct itself, recording animals and patterns, but leaving the mirror of humanity fractured in memory rather than picture. Even now, when we find ourselves frozen at the lifeless eyes of a doll, or unsettled by the strange rhythm of a digital face, we are not simply reacting to artifice, we are echoing survival's oldest shield, remembering in our bones the days when our existence was never solitary, when the world was filled with neighbors too close to comfort, and the instinct to retreat was the thread that kept life unbroken through the ages. The uncanny valley is not only a story of fear, but also of shaping, for in its shadows, humanity found the edges of itself. Unease forced the hand to clarify what belonging meant. It urged kin to bind themselves together more tightly, to reaffirm family with gesture, ornament, and ritual, as though the act of defining identity was as crucial to survival as food or fire. Perhaps it was the uncanny itself that sharpened humanity's hunger not only for life, but for meaning. Imagine a hunt successful, the kill dragged back with sweat and triumph, meat divided, skins prepared, laughter filling the air. In these moments, community thrived. Belonging was confirmed, yet imagine too that only days earlier, another group had been glimpsed across the horizon. Faces eerily close, but not truly known, that shadow lingered over the triumph, reminding hunters and families alike that celebration could only be safe within the circle of the familiar. Unease became the quiet wall that surrounded joy, protecting it even in its height. The valley lived not only in encounters, but in anticipation, in the knowledge that the landscape itself was alive with others. Always near, never fully absent, caution wrapped itself around daily life as constant as breath, ensuring that vigilance never lay dormant. One cannot say where vigilance ends and culture begins, for perhaps they were never separate. Over time, unease gave birth to expression, to symbols that carved boundaries upon the body, beads of shell, pigments pressed into hair, marks across skin, all reminders that identity must be declared again and again, for the closer the likeness of others pressed, the sharper the need to define the self. In this sense, culture itself is the child of unease, and still, unease transformed into myth, memory polished into narrative, tribe to tribe, fire to fire, until whole traditions were born that rested upon the echoes of what had once been simple instinct, giants looming on mountainsides, small folk haunting caves, shadow dwellers slipping through forests, all of them carrying the same essence. Beings close to us, but divided by some fracture too subtle to name, their likeness enough to threaten, their otherness enough to force caution. Even in later ages, when civilizations rose and carved stone into temples, the myths remained, carried in whispers, written into tales, reshaped into folklore, reminders of the uncanny experience, long after the beings themselves had faded, proof that stories are stronger than silence, that instinct reaches further than time. The uncanny thus became a bridge between what was lived and what was imagined, shaping our perception not only of others, but of art, of belonging, of ritual, and of story, so that even as we live now, in a world emptied of those cousins, we remain guided by the residue of their presence, and when we confront the uncanny in modern forms, in masks too lifelike, in robotic eyes that gleam without soul, what we truly face is not wires or wax, but the echoes of fires built long ago upon the plains and in the caves. We are facing memory itself, alive within us, pressed upon us by ancestors who once stared into strange faces and felt survival carried on the tide of unease. The uncanny valley can be seen as a silence that holds its own power. It lingers not because it was chosen, but because it was carved into being by time itself. Our ancestors never wrote its rules, they lived them, guided through nights where fire crackled low and shadows stretched long. Each encounter deepened the instinct, each pause reinforced its whisper, until unease became as steady a companion as hunger or thirst. When one thinks of humanity's rise, it is tempting to imagine triumph alone, the march of progress unfolding as though the path were clear. Yet the truth was far more fragile. Life hung in balance, sharpened by storms, predators, and scarcity, but also sharpened by neighbors with brows too heavy or eyes too deep, who could unsettle even without threat. Neighbors who were reflections not far enough away to dismiss, and not close enough to embrace. Picture the great forests, dense with rustling branches, the smell of damp earth rising heavy with every breath. A group pauses as faint sounds echo through the trees. The sound could be deer, could be kin, but the moment the figures appear, unease surges. Human in stride, human in form, yet something fractured in detail, in the weighting of the limbs, in the curve of the jaw, in the still and glinting awareness of the eyes. This was not beast, not family. It was the valley itself, awake and alive in every beat of the hunters' hearts. What endured from these encounters was not just the conflict that sometimes followed, but the subtler layer, the instinct to hesitate, even when no harm had yet been given. This hesitation wrote itself into memory stronger than battle, because it preserved without destruction. It warned without speaking. Its quiet effectiveness ensured it lasted longer than weapons themselves could. Here we see how culture too unfolded in response. Identity had to be announced again and again, through beads of stone, through paint of ochre, through bones shaped into adornment. These were not symbols of vanity, but of necessity. And so the uncanny valley does not rest in stories of puppets or machines alone. It rests in millennia of reinforcement, in the glances across valleys that stiffened with caution, in the footsteps discovered near rivers that spoke of neighbors unseen. Unease itself has been a thread longer than empire, longer than language, stretching across the very span of humanity. Now, in our world of lights and cities, the echoes return in new forms, but the old source has not vanished. When unease stirs at a face not fully alive, yet painfully familiar, it is not an error of technology we feel. It is the echo of warnings left behind by a world once crowded with faces that blurred identity. It is ancient survival speaking still. The uncanny valley holds a mirror to us, yet it is a mirror strangely fractured, for what unsettles is not distance, but nearness, not the predator with fangs, or the storm that rages, but the neighbor whose reflection feels just slightly twisted. This paradox became one of the deepest forces guiding our ancestors, a force not shouted in conflict, but whispered in perception, steady and persistent. Imagine the openness of a tundra, snow hushed across the plain, figures moving in the distance, their breath puffing into the stark air. Hunters pause, squint across the wide expanse, and there in the shifting haze of cold, they see forms that move upright, shapes that carry spears, the silhouettes almost indistinguishable from their own families. But in stillness, when light angles across them, something betrays them. The slope of shoulders, the curve of skull, the rhythm of their stride. It is enough to send a ripple of unease through the heart. What followed such sights was not always violence. It may have been distance, quiet retreat into different valleys or caves, but the lesson endured regardless, each hesitation tightening into instinct, each moment of unease quietly selecting who endured and who vanished. The uncanny valley was an unseen hand upon survival, guiding choices that wrote themselves into the long memory of humanity. And still unease bore fruit in culture language, slowly grew its roots in the soil of belonging, words forming ways to mark us from them. Songs sung at dusk reinforcing closeness, painting kinship as song, so that difference could never breach trust within the circle. Even silence was sharpened by unease for silence, guarded against strangers who might resemble but not belong. This unease rippled into ritual as well. Fire became more than warmth, it became boundary. The circle of flame, a declaration of protection, not only from beasts, but from the uncanny. It lit faces clearly. It whispered reassurance as shadows leaned away. It allowed recognition and erased confusion. In this way, fire grew sacred, not only for its heat, but as the light that separated comfort from unease. And myths grew richer from these encounters. For what cannot be fully understood does not vanish. It transforms. Children heard tales of figures roaming forests too close to humans, tales of mountain dwellers whose faces seemed familiar but twisted. Hearing these stories, unease transformed into narrative and thus outlived the encounters themselves. The more they were told, the more they became framework, gently pressing vigilance into the ears of children who would one day guard fires of their own. The uncanny valley continues because it was never about one age, but every age. It has no single origin point, but flows across time like a current, bending itself to each new circumstance, yet never breaking. And so even thousands of years later, When wax faces unsettle us or digital imitations stir suspicion, it is not modern invention, it is ancient remembering. It is shadows pressing themselves forward through blood, whispering that nearness has always been the root of danger. If identity was shaped from within, then the uncanny was the hammer from without, striking again and again, pressing humans to declare themselves, to draw signs, to build circles of trust that could endure shadows. Without it, perhaps identity would not have needed such form. But with it, belonging was sharpened into permanence, leaving behind the long legacy we still feel today. The uncanny valley may be thought of as a threshold, a doorway between recognition and rejection. It is where closeness no longer comforts, but sharpens into suspicion. Our ancestors lived with this doorway always around them, stepping across it each time they encountered beings who looked like kin yet unsettled with every detail. And the valley itself was not a place to linger. It was a place to withdraw, for survival depended not on hesitation alone, but on heeding the warning carried by unease. Imagine a cave mouth surrounded by mist at dawn, the fire from the night before smoldering low, embers softly glowing in the dark. Outside comes the crunch of steps upon gravel. The family inside stiffens, each movement still and careful. And then a figure emerges through the haze, a figure too familiar, upright, fire-warmed, carrying tools, but its face deep set with shadows, its body broader, its shape wrong in details, each glance carrying the weight of recognition twisted into dread. In this moment, every breath tightens. Unease teaches without a voice, even if no violence followed, even if the figure passed into fog and vanished the lesson. Carved deep to trust unease was to live to mistrust. It was to risk the collapse of family. In this sense, the uncanny valley was a teacher, more persistent than storm, more enduring than hunger for storms past. But unease accompanied every step, marking itself onto every path carved by our species. Over generations, this unspoken lesson grew into culture more complex than caution. Humans began making tools not only for use, but for meaning. Beads strung upon cord, paint streaked across skin, bones carved into ornaments, all carrying the same silent message. These are ours. This is belonging. This is identity. Unease demanded clarity. And clarity gave rise to cultural expression. Stories, too, grew sharper, telling of others who lived close but unnervingly different. Figures lurking in forest shadows, creatures within caves who reflected humanity without claiming it, giants taller than ordinary men, or smaller beings whose frames unsettled in equal measure. These tales softened real unease into words a child could hear, shaping the body's instinct into the mind's tradition, ensuring vigilance carried forward whether or not the others still lived, and silence carried the story as much as narrative did. For ancient art often honored animals in detail, but left the almost humans absent. Perhaps their likeness stirred too much discomfort. Perhaps representing them risked awakening the unease that flickered whenever they were near. The choice to omit becomes as revealing as choice to include, reminding us that what was too uncanny in life remained too uncanny in remembrance. The uncanny valley, it was not only something felt under threat, it was woven into the expansion of human identity. It shaped how we marked ourselves, how we told stories, how symbols arose and traditions grew. It was as much a creator as it was a warning, pressing humans to build stronger definitions of belonging by living always in contrast to those who blurred it. And so we inherit not only a feeling but a history when we pause before a wax face or recoil from a digital gaze. It may seem modern, yet it is more ancient than writing. It is the echo of countless dawns where strangers appeared and vanished, countless campfires where stories were shaped to soften unease, countless generations who survived because they trusted the valley's silent voice. The glow of embers slowly faded as new light broke through cracks of stone and branches above. With morning came the soft stir of wind whispering through valleys, carrying scents of soil dampened by night air. For those who lived in these lands, the day never began in safety. It began in watchfulness, eyes scanning for movement, ears tuned for rhythms that spoke of presence too close. In the distance across the expanse of grass and low shrubs, tracks could often be found, not the deep-pressed prints of antelope or the clawed edges of predators, but footprints eerily akin to their own, yet always marked by subtle strangeness, a heel wider, a stride longer, a pattern of wear shaped by bodies that walk differently, but with the same upright posture. To stumble across such imprints was to feel memory etch itself into the chest without explanation, each print a quiet messenger of warning. The traces were often enough to unsettle without confrontation, teaching families to move differently, to choose rivers further away, to seek caves less obvious. It was survival, guided by absence as much as presence. Fear of meeting those who were near, yet not the same, became a thread twisting through every day. Around fires, these impressions transformed into stories, told and retold until even children knew, without seeing why their elders stiffened at signs in the soil. Stories added shadows to the footprints, turning them into figures haunting forests, beings that lived nearby, yet were rarely seen fully. This translation from instinct into myth granted language to unease and gave structure to the silence of caution. And always the senses were trained, for recognition was both gift and burden. The face was the truest field of judgment, and in every flicker of firelight, families studied one another, learning the repose of familiar features, so that anything even slightly bent would be noticed in a breath. Vigilance became art, interpretation became survival. Closeness without belonging tested the heart more deeply than any predator could, for lions and wolves announced themselves as other, but those near reflections, carrying shadows of humanness, spoke to identity itself. In them lay the question not of simple threat, but of blurred belonging. And to keep identity sharp, humans turned unease into practice, marking bodies, circling fires, binding tailies with lessons. It is striking to consider that even in those silent landscapes, culture was already responding. Beads strung in deliberate patterns, pigments daubed upon skin, ornaments carved with care, each carrying messages of us and not them. Belonging declared openly, because unease made secrecy too dangerous. Every symbol a boundary, every mark an answer to the blurred traces discovered across the plains. Even now, when wax faces unsettle or digital figures disturb, what we feel is shaped not only by some general discomfort, but by echoes of these long-vanished mornings when families studied footprints in soft earth and wondered who else walked the world beside them, and in that wondering felt the same quiet tightening in the chest, the instinct that shaped survival across uncounted dawns. As the day stretched into its middle hours and the heat of the sun pressed upon the land, people often moved in small groups across high ridges, scanning below for game, for water, for safety. Yet what they saw was not always beast or prey. Sometimes the eyes caught the shape of other fires far off, thin lines of smoke curling upward like pale threads against the sky. And such sights were enough to change a day, to pull hunters away from fertile ground, simply because the knowledge of closeness brought too much weight. Smoke itself became a kind of language, an unspoken signal that more than one kind of human shared the earth. The distance might have been great, yet the unease was immediate, for every smoke curl whispered of faces nearby, faces not fully known, not fully trusted. The valley widened in imagination long before contact ever occurred. Children learned to feel this weight early, perhaps while carrying water back to camp or gathering roots at the forest edge, perhaps while staring wide-eyed at the thin line of gray rising above far trees. They asked no questions. They watched the reactions of their elders, who shifted uneasily, who decided to stay closer to their fire that night, who lowered their voices as dusk fell, and the children absorbed the lesson without words, that even the smallest mark of other presence carried danger folded within it. Tools, too, told the same story. For along rivers and cliffs, stone flakes littered the ground, sharp, clean, evidence of deliberate action. Yet often these belonged not to kin, but to others, others who cut stone with skill, unnervingly close to the same. Our ancestors held these fragments in their hands, and the stone whispered with unsettling voices. Voices of cousins unseen, voices that doubled human reflection back upon itself until heartbeat grew uneasy, and between every discovery, stories were shaped again, carried in tones quieter than laughter, careful warnings wrapped in images. The others were not dismissed as animals. They were woven into lore, spirits of the woods, keepers of caves, shadows who walked upright when twilight fell. Such tales gave form to unease, gave rhythm to memory, and deepened vigilance in the generations who would inherit it. It was not always violence. Often it was absence built of withdrawal camps, abandoned before contact paths altered hunts. Redirected and unspoken avoidance, carried by the feeling of things too close, yet not safe. Absence itself became the action unease shaped, and survival rode upon its decisions. Culture sharpened itself in this shadow. For every necklace strung from shells, every hand painted with ochre, every ritual repeated at fire's edge was a reply to unease, a reminder to the circle that belonging was solid and marked, a clarity forged to protect against confusion. Identity, therefore, was sculpted, not simply from celebration, but from vigilance, drawn sharper under the pressure of difference. And long after the neighbors themselves faded, long after their fires smoked for the last time, the imprint endured passed across generations, imprinted into the ways humans respond to likeness that is too near, but not complete. The responses live unchanged, for when we today recoil at the hollow eyes of a lifelike figure, or the strange cadence of a machine's false smile, what we recoil from is not invention, but memory. Memory older than language, older than names, kept alive in the hush of instincts that breathe beneath thought. Evenings were the most delicate of times, when the line between comfort and unease grew thin. The fire burned brighter as shadows stretched longer, and with every flicker of flame came the chance that something watched from beyond the circle. Sedge, this was the hour when the senses sharpened most, when unease taught vigilance in its purest form, not as fear that breaks into panic, but as the quiet readiness of a heart unwilling to be fooled by what appeared almost safe. It is easy to picture families, gathered close, their faces warm against the glow, their backs chilled by the night, air listening to the faint crackling, when suddenly a noise breaks the stillness, a long step upon dry leaves, the crack of a branch beneath weight. The figures turn their heads, a shape briefly visible at the tree line upright, taller than most, moving with strange rhythm, no animal not kin, something between familiarity and fracture. Unease sweeps like a tide over every chest. Hands grip closer to spears, voices flatten to silence. The valley makes itself known again. Perhaps nothing followed. Perhaps the stranger melted back into darkness, leaving no fight, no violence, only memory. But in memory itself lived the teaching that nearness can wear the mask of danger, that the comfort of likeness must be tested always, and such lessons shape the fabric of identity as surely as tools or fire itself. In time, these encounters could no longer be separated from the stories they birthed. Children were raised not only by the arms of parents, but also by the weight of myths. Whispered as smoke drifted into stars, a tale of the others who haunted rivers, the others who waited at the edges of forest paths. They resembled enough to confuse. They differed enough to unsettle. Their very persistence in story reminds us how deeply encounters pressed themselves into the marrow of humanity. Even silence held myth disguised, for when art refused to capture the faces of those who unsettled, it still spoke loudly, their absence polling meaning across walls and stones. Culture revealed itself as shaped just as much by what it avoided as by what it honored. These silences, too, were the valley's creation, preserving unease even through omission. And rituals gave this unease order. Fires, lit not only for warmth, but as boundary pigments, swirled not only as display, but as marker of identity, shoulders painted to distinguish beads strung into patterns. So unique, they declared belonging before a word was spoken. These things tell us that human life has always been an act of circle building, circles drawn tightly enough to separate from those who carried faces almost right, but not entirely. Strange that it is this same unease we still feel when figures carved in wax glare back too nearly human, or when moving images crafted by machines falter in expression. Though our world is far removed from forests and caves, the pulse of reaction is identical, the same ancient whisper telling us to guard boundaries, to resist surrender to likeness that is bent, to trust unease as wisdom born across countless nights when firelight met watching eyes. What lingers now is less about others still living, and more about echoes sculpted into our perception, a legacy not chosen, but carried, a quiet inheritance reminding us that survival was never a matter of recognizing beasts alone, but of knowing when to turn away from reflections too fractured to embrace. Night after night, the boundary between the seen and unseen created its own kind of map, a map not drawn onto bark or stone, but carried inside the body. The places where others had been glimpsed became edges of this mental world, zones carried in memory as places to avoid, pools of water that tasted of unease, caves whose air seemed heavy, trails where footprints pressed too clear against the soil. The uncanny did not simply haunt moments, it shaped landscapes themselves. To walk through such a world meant moving through layers of presence, always with the thought that life was not solitary, always with the recognition that other hands shaped tools just as skillful. Other fires glowed, other voices muttered in tones too strange to mimic kin. This constant awareness was both gift and burden. It preserved survival, yet suffused daily rhythms with caution. The uncanny did not require confrontation. It was most powerful in suggestion. When hunters scanned our horizon and saw smoke columns faint and long, when wanderers pressed their fingers against stone flakes abandoned by unknown hands, when the wind carried a song like a call, shaped but alien in cadence, all of it folded into the same inheritance. The recognition of nearness unraveled into tension, and through these moments culture grew, not by accident, but as deliberate reply. Every ornament was reassurance, every pigment applied was declaration, every fire was both warmth and wall. Unease demanded these creations not as expressions of beauty alone, but as defenses, necessary signals to remind both kin and others where belonging lay. Around the fire, lessons turned into story, story into myth, myth into rhythm that carried through generations. No child raised in such a world could ever escape the steady drumbeat of warning, delivered in tales of creatures half alike and half other, passed not for simple entertainment, but as instruction that unease was a truth to be trusted, a truth older than words. Consider, too, the silence threaded into art. How caves speak with images of animals and spirals, yet fall quiet before the depiction of almost humans. Perhaps the artist turned away from representation because it risked reviving the unease too vividly. Perhaps avoidance itself is the most revealing echo of all, showing how deeply those encounters unsettled. The uncanny present, not in pigment, but in omission. This inheritance endured even after the others vanished, for absence does not erase impression. Unease required no living presence to sustain itself. It endured in story, in instinct, in the architecture of emotion, surviving long after fires in other valleys had gone cold, surviving long enough to surface in us. When we glance at dolls whose eyes glimmer too sharply, or watch false faces animated by strange rhythms, even in this modern age, surrounded by walls, lights, machines, the old whisper still hums, urging vigilance, not in fear of predators, but in the subtle moment when recognition turns to doubt. It is through this whisper that our ancestors still speak, for through unease they protected us. Through unease they left behind the most enduring of survival tools, not stone or fire, but the instinct to guard the boundary between likeness and kinship. The world of our ancestors was a place of echoes, where every sound meant something more. The snap of a branch was not dismissed, the rise of birds into sudden flight was not ignored, and the print of a foot in soft soil was never taken lightly. Each sign spoke of presence. And the most disturbing presences of all or those that looked so much like the human form, yet stirred discomfort in ways language could not capture. For it was not the predator's claw that unsettled deepest, but the footprints and voices of beings who walked like people but were not within the circle of kin. In such a world, memory itself became guidebook. Families carrying not drawn maps, but stories, pointing out stretches of forest said to belong to others, caves whispered as dangerous, because shapes had once emerged from their mouths, whether true or embellished. These stories gave direction, and the direction was most often away. Unease not only preserved the body in one night's encounter, it shaped travel, settlement, and migration. Imagine a child tending embers at dusk, the air cooling around them, listening to elders speak of valleys where fires had once gleamed across ridges, fires that drew closer through the years until silence came suddenly, leaving only suspicion. To the adults, such tales were instruction, but to the child, they were not abstractions. They seeped into blood as inheritance, carried forward long after the valley grew dark and empty. Even when contact did not occur, artifacts gave presence enough. Stone blades left behind, bones broken with patterns too deliberate, ashes faint but undeniable. The land itself felt inhabited by neighbors unseen. In this way, the uncanny stretched beyond faces and bodies. It clung to material proof. Even objects touched by others became sources of unease, as though the stone itself still carried their likeness. And within these lessons grew the importance of separation. Fire circles no longer served only to cook or warm. They drew symbolic lines, light against dark, identity against confusion. To sit within the light was to belong. To stand beyond it was to risk being mistaken for those who resembled without truly being. The fire, therefore, became more than flame. It was culture blazing against the blurred boundaries unease constantly threatened to erode. In story and ritual, unease settled most deeply, shaping lessons for generations unborn. Giants painted across mountains of imagination. Little people said to sing within caverns. Shadow dwellers haunting the night. So many forms with one shared essence. The presence of beings almost human. A presence transformed into myth, so it could be carried more easily than memory alone. Even today, these echoes travel softly, for in every culture, there remain tales of those near, but not us, blurred reflections passed into modern legends. Their persistence not proof of reality, but proof of instinct, the eternal endurance of sensations shaped by a crowded ancient world. Unease remained long after its origin vanished, whispering still when we pause at likenesses poorly shaped, when we step back from faces too near to human, but lacking the soul of kin. It tells us again what it told our ancestors beneath firelight, that boundaries protect, that survival owes as much to hesitation as to courage, and that the faint tremor of unease is not error, but wisdom, more enduring than fire, older than story, as constant as breath itself. In the long rhythm of countless seasons, the instinct of unease became one of the most enduring companions of humanity. It whispered with every step into new landscapes, guiding not only encounters, but the shaping of choice itself. Rivers crossed or avoided, caves entered or abandoned, fires lit in places where sight lines left no room for ambush. Survival was never random, it was always measured, and often those measurements were guided by the quiet pull of distrust when likeness blurred too close. The feeling was not violent at first, it was subtle, a tightening of breath, a narrowing of the eyes, an unexplainable shift in posture. But when repeated through generations, subtlety became permanence. Feelings etched themselves into instinct, instincts etched themselves into lineage, so that even long after the beings who inspired them vanished, the lessons lived on, alive in memory older than story. Picture an open plain where wind bends stalks of tall grass in long waves. Hunters kneel upon the ground, examining prints so nearly their own that judgment falters. Were these made by kin days ago, or by others who pressed their presence into the earth? Uncertainty itself was a teacher, for in hesitation, the hunters learned their safest choice was wariness. To continue without certainty was to risk more than the hunt. It was to risk survival itself. Even shadows of similarity left deep scars for, to see in another hand, the mastery of stone or the comfort of flame. Unsettled identity. What then did it mean to be human, when others could shape, strike, and kindle in almost the same rhythm? Perhaps it was this tension that pressed our kind to refine symbols, language, art, as if to draw sharper lines, so such closeness could not confuse belonging. Around the fires, stories took the role of tutors. Stories that wove unease into narrative, so children could be cautious without needing first-hand encounter. Stories that softened harsh truths into images both terrifying and protective. Shadow dwellers who mirrored kin but carried strangeness, giants who threatened from mountainsides, small people half hidden in caves. Each story not invention, but transformation of perception into memory, designed to endure. It is telling that these tales survive even now, not concentrated in one land or one people, but scattered across the breadth of the world, carried down in traditions unlinked by geography, yet resonant in rhythm. A child in one corner of Earth and a child in another absorb warnings of others almost human, and this tells us that the seed was never local but global, planted in shared experience, blossoming in shared unease. This instinct translated into silence too, in the emission of almost humans from caves and carvings where animals leapt full and free. The absence of these beings in the art of memory suggests not forgetfulness, but caution even in depiction. Unease avoided permanence, as though to draw the likeness risked summoning the discomfort itself. Better to leave such beings between fire and shadow than to carve them into eternal stone. And though we live now in a world where those others are gone, their echo returns whenever a face not truly living bends too near our own. Mannequins in stillness, statues with gaze too sharp, machines formed into imitation, carrying a rhythm ever so slightly fractured. We answer them instinctively with the same narrowing of breath, proof that the inheritance is unbroken. Unease is still the steady guardian time carved into us. As seasons rolled endlessly forward, unease grew into the silent compass of life, pointing not only toward safety, but toward identity. For to recognize kin was to affirm belonging, and to resist the pull of likeness bent out of place was to preserve it. The feeling itself became a story written into the nerves of every person, so deeply carved that long after its origin faded, it could still be felt in the shiver along the skin. In the hush of twilight, families often gathered in wide circles, the warmth of embers pressing against their faces as their backs turned toward shadow. Here, stories were told as much to remind as to teach. Stories of others dwelling in caves where light never reached, of figures who moved along ridges at dusk, almost kin but strangers at heart. Children listened not simply with ears but with breath, each story weaving unease directly into their small bodies, preparing them for a future where survival required hesitation. Hesitation became ritual, not only in pause before movement, but in patterns traced upon lives, ornaments marked belonging to family and tribe. Pigments smeared across the body affirmed kinship with clarity, so no likeness could confuse or deceive. These were not ornaments of vanity, but ornaments of boundary, walls built from color and shape, so that the circle remained closed against intrusion. Even the earth itself told similar stories. Stone flakes scattered on ground spoke of strangers close by. Bones split by foreign skill betrayed other hands at work. Ashes resting cold in cave corners revealed that fires had burned before. All these things kept unease alive without sight of a face. Absence itself proved enough to stoke vigilance, proving that memory and meaning were not only kept in blood, but in what the land itself carried. And so culture thickened within the tension, shaped less by triumph than by wariness, by the whisper of difference carried forward. Perhaps this is why human beings came to shape symbols so eagerly, why songs and rituals became so important, for the presence of almost kin demanded affirmation of belonging again and again. Unease was insistent, and so identity had to be made insistent too. The echoes of these feelings lived beyond their necessity. surfacing centuries onward in tales that spanned continents, in the patterns of folklore strange yet consistent, from mountains to plains, from forests to islands. Stories always carried hints of others near, but never fully embraced. Almost human, yet not quite kin. A theme too widespread to be accident, too shared to be invention of chance. It reveals that our earliest teachers were experiences themselves, shaping the instincts of all humanity together. When we feel the unease, even today, it is not simply a reaction to artifice. It is the resurfacing of all those ancient layers pressed upon us, the same unease that once warned families away from valleys haunted by footprints, that once turned fires toward inward circles, that once forbade artists from etching faces too close to fractured kin. That same feeling jolts the chest when confronted by likeness bent only slightly. If survival itself was a thread, then unease was the loom upon which it was woven, quiet, unseen, but fundamental, for without it, perhaps humanity would not have endured amid the shadows of cousins who walked beside them. Each day in the ancient world carried both sustenance and strain, the gathering of fruit, the steady patience of a hunt, the laughter of children at riverbanks. Yet beneath all of this lived the constant awareness of others, shadows almost indistinguishable from kin. Their closeness never permitted full rest, for even in joy, unease coiled softly, waiting, guiding, whispering limits no one dared to ignore. Imagine a high plateau where families prepared skins to protect against the cold, the work done with rhythmic precision, each gesture familiar. But then across the horizon, a movement stirred, silhouettes bent against the wind. They too wore skins, they too walked upright, they too bent low to carry burdens. For a moment recognition brought hope, but within a breath, unease rushed in, for their figures bore difference unhideable, strides heavier, skulls broad, hands swinging differently, a reflection of humanity that unsettled far more than it welcomed. It is not difficult to imagine that entire migrations began with these faint tensions. Valleys left behind when others moved too near, rivers abandoned though fertile, simply because boundaries blurred until safety could no longer be trusted. The uncanny was therefore not a passing sensation, but a quiet sculptor of the very paths humanity carved across the earth, guiding choices of where to remain and where to leave. This inheritance was not only in movement, it rested also in memory. Memory passed down through song-like speech and story, 1,000 retellings forging caution into permanence. Perhaps no one remembered the first encounter, but all remembered the feeling it birthed, and children raised within its rhythm grew into adults who carried the valley as truth without ever naming it. Fire itself became a language of separation, its glow not just warmth, but clarifying light, illuminating faces and dissolving unease within circles of trust. Outside that glow, however, every shape was suspect, every sound measured against the possibility of nervous, without familiarity. Firelight declared belonging, darkness preserved the uncanny. This duality became an endless drumbeat in human existence. Symbols, too, became declarations, beads strung across the neck, ochre painted upon the skin, lines pressed upon walls, all reminders that humanity did not exist in isolation. But in delicate contrast, unease demanded proof, demanded markers, demanded certainty, and in answering its demands, humans grew ever more layered in culture. Even in silence, the uncanny carried weight. For what was avoided in art tells its own story. The caves left us animals dancing in pigment, punts carved in sweeping elegance, spirals of abstract forms. Yet absent are the reflections of those almost kin, kept deliberately from permanence, their likeness too unsettling to bind in pigment, their memory carried instead in instinct and story, shadows left unpainted whispering all the louder. And long after these others vanished into earth, unease remained loyal, as it does even now when faces sculpted too close, or machines speaking in human tones jolt our perception that feeling is not error, it is inheritance. The same quiet guardian that once turned families away from valleys smoking with foreign fires, The same old companion carved by closeness and difference entwined. It reminds us still that survival was never only strength of arm or cunning of mind, but the subtle shield of knowing when to step back, when the familiar bends into strangeness too deep to trust. Time has always reshaped the world, glaciers retreating, forests spreading, seas swallowing coastlines, and with these shifts humanity too changed. Yet one thing remained untouched by weather or season: the inheritance of instinct, the quiet knowledge carried in the bones, that unease must be given voice, that not all likeness is safe, that memory can live without names or faces, preserved in the recoil of the body against strangeness cloaked in sameness. Imagine the last of the Neanderthal fires, smoldering within some valley of stone, their tools scattered, their voices faint in the distance of time. Meanwhile, our ancestors pressed forward, carrying not only food and children, but the impressions those voices left behind. Soon the others were gone, absorbed in strands of blood or erased by silence. Yet their echoes lived long after, not through presence, but through absence folded into instinct. Across generations, this instinct never weakened. Though its objects vanished, it sharpened instead, embedded more deeply, so that even now it lingers, waiting to awaken at the sight of things close, yet not complete. This is why faces of wax disturb, why machines molded too humanly make us flinch. They summon not a modern discomfort, but the oldest inheritance still awake inside us. The uncanny was both shield and chisel. It protected with vigilance, and it sculpted identity itself, shaping communities into circles of belonging, pushing humans to decorate, to paint, to carve, to mark one another, as kin so clearly that confusion could not erode trust. Our culture, beads, pigments, rituals, myths, may have grown not only from wonder, but from unease. Art may shine as beauty, yet perhaps beneath its glow lies the pressure of survival, forged first in the presence of others, just near enough to unsettle. And so across lands once crowded with cousins, humanity carried home fire, story symbol and unease, combining them into a legacy that endured longer than any line of stone tools or painted walls. Unease became inheritance delivered from parent to child, without word memory too deep for silence to erase. Think of the myths that still survive. In mountains giants dwell, in caves the small hidden people linger. In shadows strange beings imitate humans with disturbing perfection. These are not accidents of imagination, but fossils of feeling. Stories are bones made of words, carrying structure long after flesh of truth has vanished. They prove that instinct can disguise itself endlessly, yet never lose its core. Now we live in a world emptied of those shadows, alone at last upon the earth. Yet when faces molded by artifice stir discomfort in us, when eyes painted on statues glance too sharply, when machines grin without warmth, it is not wires or clay that disturb us. It is memory awakening, the ancient caution rising exactly as it was meant to, for instinct does not vanish simply because the reason is gone. And thus the long story of unease is the long story of survival itself, a reminder passed unbroken, not of fear alone, but of vigilance, of identity, of belonging, kept strong because unease never allowed it to blur. The others may have fallen silent, but the feeling they stirred has endured 1,000 lifetimes, shaping us as surely as the fire we carried through darkness. The story of unease, of shadows walking beside us, is not a story sealed in books or buried entirely in the soil. It is a story that lingers inside, carried softly from distant fires, from valleys no longer filled with voices, from traces that pressed themselves into instinct more faithfully than into stone. We are alone upon the earth now, but not alone in memory, for within us lives the whisper of cousins whose faces we recognized, yet never embraced, whose nearness taught us who we were, and whose absence remains the presence of an echo still heard. Unease has endured as their quiet gift, guiding us gently, shaping us subtly, a companion more ancient than story itself. As we drift away from these long paths of prehistory, let the weight loosen, the caution soften, for the story is not meant to trouble, but to remind. to remind that we are the inheritors of survival beyond counting, that every breath carries with it the voices of those before, and that vigilance served its purpose well. Now the fire burns low, the circle is warm, and silence stretches kindly across the horizon. You may rest here, knowing that the echoes of unease will watch as they always have, steady, unbroken, older than words, as constant as the night sky itself.